Long before the end of the 8th century, Ireland was not cut off from the Scandinavian world. Contacts had existed for quite some time, and the signs of that earlier connection are hard to ignore. One of the clearest clues comes from an Irish scholar living at the Frankish court in the early 9th century, who wrote that the Faroe Islands had once been inhabited by Irish hermits, but had later been emptied by Norwegian pirates. By the time he wrote, the monks were gone, and the islands were said to be full of sheep. This matters because it suggests that Irish churchmen in the North Atlantic were encountering Scandinavians before the great wave of Viking attacks reached Ireland itself. The Faroes were touched by Viking movement before Ireland was, and the Irish hermits living there were hardly cut off from the rest of the world. Travel between Ireland and distant island hermitages seems to have been more common than people once imagined. News, stories, and warnings would have moved along those same sea routes. That means the learned communities in Ireland may already have known something about the northern peoples before the first attacks began. When Irish annals describe the newcomers simply as pagans, the word may hide a deeper familiarity than it first appears to reveal. Even so, the first Viking attacks struck Ireland with real force and alarm. The shock can be felt in the surviving record. The disasters that fell upon the great monastery of Iona were so severe that they were remembered in language echoing the destruction of sacred cities. In 802, the monastery was burned. Only a few years later, during another raid, dozens of monks were slaughtered. The leadership of the community was shaken, and the search for a safer refuge began almost at once. This led to the foundation of a new monastery at Kells, intended as a place of protection for treasures, relics, and perhaps senior members of the church. Around the same time, the first Viking attack recorded on Irish soil took place in 795, when Rathlin Island was burned and Skye was plundered. These events were not yet the beginning of full conquest, but they were unmistakable warnings. A new and dangerous power had entered the waters around Ireland. At first, the attacks were scattered and coastal. The raiders struck exposed religious sites, and then vanished. The annals do not claim to record every single raid, but they still give a reliable sense of the pattern. After the early attacks on Rathlin and Skye, another church was burned near the coast, and raiders seized supplies from nearby territories, probably demanding food and livestock from frightened local communities. The same records speak more generally of heavy incursions in both Ireland and Britain. By 807, the raiders had rounded the northern coast and were reaching monasteries farther west. Places off the Sligo coast and in the waters of Galway Bay were attacked. For the first time, the Irish sources begin to mention actual fighting between local forces and Viking bands. These were not yet great battles, but quick clashes, local skirmishes, and desperate acts of resistance. In the years that followed, different Irish groups managed at times to beat back the raiders, while in other places the Vikings killed local leaders and returned again. Their groups may still have been relatively small, perhaps only a few ships at a time, but they were already learning the coastline, the weak points, and the wealth of the island. Then, after this early phase of pressure, something strange happened. The record falls quiet for several years. There is no clear sign of Viking activity in Ireland for a notable stretch of time. That silence may not mean the raiders had vanished. It may instead suggest that their efforts were concentrated elsewhere, perhaps in the islands and western coasts of Scotland. When attacks begin to appear again, they are more intense and better organised. From the early 820s, monasteries in the Irish Sea Zone and along the south and east coasts came under renewed assault. Even remote island monasteries were no longer safe. One monastic superior was captured and so badly treated that he died in captivity. In the northeast, the coastal monasteries of the Ulaid were repeatedly struck. Some were looted with exceptional violence, while local kings occasionally managed to defeat the attackers. From this point on, the brief opening phase was over. The first real Viking age in Ireland had begun. The earliest raids may have been launched from southwestern Norway, but the larger attacks that followed were probably coming from much closer bases. Moving large fleets directly from Norway again and again would have been difficult. The scale of operations described in Irish sources suggests that the raiders were now working from settlements already established in the Northern Isles and Western Isles of Scotland. That would explain both their growing strength and the sudden return of heavy activity after years of relative quiet. Ireland was no longer facing occasional seaborne predators from a far-off homeland. It was facing a regional military network with nearby bases, growing confidence and increasingly ambitious leaders. By the early 830s, the pressure had become far more alarming. Viking raiders were no longer content with quick coastal strikes. They began capturing kings, taking noble prisoners for ransom, and attacking major church centres with repeated force. In one case, a local king and his brother were seized and carried off. Even the great Church of Armagh was drawn into direct conflict when it sent forces into the field to defend its dependent churches. Those troops were heavily defeated, and many captives were taken. That defeat exposed Armagh's wealth to Viking eyes, and soon it was attacked several times within a single month. Other churches in the region were also plundered in rapid succession. The raiders were now probing inland, moving up river systems, and striking famous religious foundations that had long served as symbols of local power and sacred prestige. These inland attacks multiplied in the mid-830s. Great monasteries in Leinster and Munster were plundered, while entire territories were devastated. This was not random robbery anymore. It was systematic pressure. Raiding parties were growing bolder, more mobile, and more destructive. In 1 year alone, there are reports of widespread devastation in Connaught, large numbers of prisoners taken, and monasteries burned in winter. Winter raiding is especially revealing. It suggests that the Vikings were no longer coming only for seasonal expeditions. They were beginning to stay. They were finding places to shelter, probably on islands or in naturally defensible coastal positions, and from there they could hold prisoners and plan future campaigns. By the middle of the 9th century, slave-taking had become an established part of their activity. Men, women, and children were no longer just victims of sudden violence. They were also captives in an expanding trade. A decisive turning point came in 837, when very large fleets appeared on the Boyne and the Liffey. These were not small raiding groups. Each fleet may have carried around 1,500 men. They attacked the East Coast kingdoms with enormous force. At first, some Irish rulers defeated them, but these early successes were followed by crushing reverses. The slaughter was remembered as immense. From this period on, Vikings began appearing regularly, not just on the sea, but deep in the river systems and inland waters of Ireland. They moved along the Shannon, the Erne, the Boyne, and Great Lakes in the north. They were learning how to turn Ireland's waterways into military highways. They also began to build fortified ship camps, defended bases where their fleets and warriors could be protected. Some of these became permanent. One was established at Annagassan in County Louth, and another at Dublin on the Liffey, the future Dublin. From these strongholds they could raid inland, dominate surrounding districts, and eventually settle. These developments marked the real beginning of Viking occupation in parts of Eastern Ireland. The men who led these expeditions were not merely wandering raiders. They were aristocratic adventurers, war leaders, and freebooters, some of whose names begin to appear in Irish sources. At first, their activity still seems somewhat fragmented, but by the middle of the 9th century, there are signs of something larger. An attempt to impose royal control over the Viking world in Ireland. This likely grew out of a Viking kingdom already established in Scotland. What seems to have happened in Ireland follows a pattern. First, exploratory raiding. Then, heavy plundering and slave-taking to break resistance. And finally, occupation supported by fortified bases and dynastic rule. By this stage, a Scandinavian kingdom centred in the Scottish zone was probably trying to bring the Viking settlements in Ireland under its authority. This becomes clearer in the annal entries that mention royal figures connected to a place called Leithlin, which most likely refers to the Viking kingdom in Scotland. In one major battle in 848, an important Viking leader described as the heir to the king of Leithlin was killed alongside a huge number of his men. So this was no minor clash. It took place near an already established Viking centre, involved powerful Irish provincial kings, and was remembered as a battle of major importance. The next year, an even larger overseas expedition arrived, apparently sent by a king determined to enforce authority over the Vikings already settled in Ireland. The force was massive, perhaps involving thousands of men. It appears to have come not to attack the Irish alone, but also to bring the independent Viking groups in Ireland under royal command. A few years later, another royal figure arrived, accepted the submission of Viking settlers, and took tribute from Irish rulers. These events reveal the emergence of organised kingship, military hierarchy, and imperial ambition within the Viking world west of Scandinavia. During the later 9th century, Dublin grew into the most powerful Viking centre in Ireland. Its rulers were active in Irish politics, warfare, and diplomacy, though they failed to conquer large territories outright. Irish resistance remained strong, and local kings were fully capable of inflicting serious defeats. Still, the Vikings became deeply entangled in Irish rivalries. They served as allies, mercenaries, and dangerous political partners. In one battle near Drogheda, hundreds of Vikings fought on one side of an Irish dynastic struggle, and many of them were killed. Dublin tried to dominate Viking activity across Ireland, and for the most part its rulers appear to have controlled the core regions that mattered most to them. Yet not all Viking settlements obeyed Dublin. Other bases existed along the southern coast and on major rivers. Fleets at Waterford, settlements on the Barrow, camps in the south, and groups active in Limerick and elsewhere often seem to have operated with a degree of independence. Some were defeated and destroyed by Irish rulers, but they remained a recurring threat. In the north, Viking bases may have been linked more closely to Dublin. When a powerful Northern Irish king attacked those northern settlements, he seized their livestock and goods, suggesting that the Vikings were not only raiders, but also landholders with surrounding farmed territory. He defeated them again in battle and may have blocked any long-term Viking expansion in that region. If so, he prevented Dublin from building a northern coastal zone that might have connected Ireland more firmly to Viking power in the Hebrides and on the Scottish west coast. Denied broad territorial conquest in Ireland, the rulers of Dublin increasingly turned their attention toward Britain. In the later 9th century, they campaigned in Pictland, took hostages, and imposed tribute. Soon afterward, they besieged and captured the great fortress of Dumbarton after a long siege, then returned to Dublin with fleets full of captives from several different peoples. These campaigns show just how wide the ambitions of the Dublin kings had become. They were not merely local rulers in Ireland. They were sea kings operating across the Irish sea world, shaping events in Scotland, northern England, and beyond. Yet their power was not secure forever. After the deaths of major rulers in the 870s, dynastic conflict tore the Dublin kingdom apart. Rival families fought for control, sons were murdered, and internal strife weakened the city. By the early 10th century, Dublin's strength had ebbed badly. In 902, the kingdoms of Brega and Leinster joined forces and drove the Vikings out of Dublin. The annals describe the expulsion in vivid terms. The pagans were driven from the fortress, many of their ships were abandoned, and the survivors fled in a broken condition. The first Viking kingdom of Dublin had collapsed, and its ruling dynasty withdrew to Scotland. That exile did not end their story. In the years that followed, members of the same dynasty were active in Scotland and northern Britain, fighting for power and re-establishing influence. Then, in 914, a great Viking fleet appeared in Waterford harbour. This marked the opening of a second Viking age in Ireland. Soon afterward, leaders of the exiled Dublin dynasty returned and took command of the renewed campaigns. One of them came to Waterford with a fleet, while another operated on the Leinster frontier. Their return immediately triggered conflict with the King of Tara, who understood how dangerous this new Scandinavian power could become, especially because it was tied to a growing kingdom in northern Britain. The fighting that followed was cautious at first, but the danger was obvious. Not long afterward, Dublin itself was retaken by the Vikings, and a new Dublin-York axis emerged. This connection between Dublin and the Scandinavian Kingdom of York would shape politics on both sides of the Irish Sea for decades. The struggle that followed was intense. The King of Tara marched against Dublin and suffered a devastating defeat near the city, losing not only the battle, but also his own life. The scale of noble deaths shocked contemporaries. After this, Viking kings from the Dublin dynasty moved between Ireland and York, ruling in one place, then the other, sometimes expelled, then restored again. Their ambitions stretched from Ireland to northern England, and at times they commanded alliances involving Scots, Britons, Danes and Norse forces from the islands. This wider political world reached a dramatic high point in the Great Confrontation at Brunanburh. The ruler of Dublin stood at the centre of a broad alliance against the English king Athelstan. To English observers, he appeared not just as a local ruler, but as the king of the Irish Sea world, a man whose influence reached across islands and coasts, far beyond Dublin itself. Though the alliance was defeated, the episode shows how powerful the Dublin kings had become. Back in Ireland, the rulers of Dublin continued to play a major part in the struggles among Irish dynasties. The city itself suffered badly at times. It was sacked with exceptional ferocity by Irish rulers who burned buildings, killed warriors, enslaved civilians, and carried off valuables. Yet Dublin recovered, and its kings returned to power again and again. Over time, one of the most important of these rulers was Amlaíb Cuaran, who moved between York and Dublin and became a central figure in both Irish and English affairs. During his long career, Dublin expanded its territorial reach, fought Leinster and Meath, and posed a serious military challenge to neighbouring kingdoms. But its growing aggression provoked an equally fierce response. In 980, the Dublin forces suffered a crushing defeat at Tara. The King of Meath followed up with a siege of Dublin and imposed harsh terms, including the release of Irish hostages and slaves. This moment broke Dublin's military power, though not its economic and political importance. At the same time, in the south, a new force was rising. The Dal Cais dynasty, based around the Lower Shannon, began to expand. Their leaders attacked Viking Limerick, destroyed fleets, plundered settlements, and killed Viking rulers. Out of this struggle emerged Brian Boru, whose ambition was nothing less than mastery over all Ireland. He understood that the Viking towns were too valuable to ignore. Their fleets, trade, cavalry, and wealth could serve a king who controlled them. Brian gradually bent the Viking ports to his will, using their resources to strengthen his own position. Dublin in particular feared that he meant to absorb it completely into a new Irish order. That fear lay behind the revolt of Dublin and Leinster at the end of the 10th century. Brian and his allies crushed them in battle, sacked Dublin, and forced its ruler, Sitric Silkenbeard, into submission. Yet the city remained restless. By the early 11th century, a final great confrontation was building. Dublin gathered allies from overseas, including forces from Orkney, Man, and the Hebrides. Brian marched against them, and on Good Friday in 1014 the two sides met at Clontarf, just outside Dublin. The battle lasted from morning until evening and ended in a bloody defeat for the Viking and Leinster alliance. Many leading men on both sides were killed, and Brian himself died after the victory. Clontarf later became famous as a great battle between Irish and Vikings, but the reality was more complex. It was not a simple war of national liberation, nor did it permanently end Viking power in Ireland. It was part of a larger struggle among Irish kings for supremacy, with Dublin fighting above all for its survival as a wealthy, semi-autonomous, sea-oriented power. Brian threatened to reduce it to obedience, much as powerful English kings had done to York. Dublin resisted because it had much to lose, not just land nearby, but influence stretching across the Irish Sea to Man, Wales, Western Scotland, and northern England. The conflict was also deeply entangled through family ties. The leading figures were connected by marriage, fosterage, and shared interests. The elite of late Viking Ireland was not divided by a clean ethnic line. It was a bilingual, interconnected ruling class that shared political habits, cultural values, and personal loyalties, even while fighting one another with extraordinary violence. After Clontarf, Dublin did not disappear. Instead, it became an ever more valuable prize in the contests among Irish rulers. One king after another tried to control it, profit from it, and use its wealth and overseas links. Sometimes it submitted peacefully, sometimes it resisted, and sometimes it became the seat of wider ambition. Kings of Leinster and Munster placed their own sons there as rulers. Ambitious overkings demanded homage from its leaders. Its influence still reached across the sea, and its bishops and trade remained important. Even in the age after the great Viking conquests, Dublin was no mere leftover colony. It was a vital political and economic centre, still tied to the wider Scandinavian world, still contested and still central to the fate of Ireland. By the 12th century, control of Dublin had become one of the clearest signs that a ruler was serious about claiming the kingship of all Ireland. Dublin was no longer simply a Viking town on the eastern coast. It had become one of the great political and economic prizes of the island, alongside other major port cities, such as Waterford and Limerick. Whoever could dominate these estuaries, command their fleets and draw wealth from their trade could present himself as a true contender for supreme authority in Ireland. The struggle for Ireland was no longer fought only across inland plains and royal centres. It was now also fought through control of harbours, ships, tribute, and the rich coastal towns that linked Ireland to the wider world. This can be seen clearly in the actions of the major rulers of the 12th century. When Teodelbach Ua Conchobar, king of Connaught, sought to expand his power in 1118, one of his boldest moves was to attack Munster and then turn on Dublin itself. He laid siege to the city, forced hostages out of it, drove out the son of his rival who had been ruling there, and then claimed the kingship of Dublin for himself. That was not a symbolic act. It was a declaration of national ambition. Years later, he went further and placed his own son in the city as ruler. Dublin had become something that could be handed to a son not merely as a local possession, but as a foundation of greater kingship. In the troubled decades that followed, when his authority was challenged, his enemies also understood the importance of the city. One of them was able to seize Dublin's resources, including a fleet said to number 200 ships. That single detail reveals the scale of the city's power. Dublin was not a marginal settlement. It was a naval and commercial force whose support could alter the balance of power across Ireland. Soon, another great contender emerged in the north. Muirse Tac Mac Lochlainn was a ruler who aimed at the highest prize, and like his rivals before him, he too understood that Dublin had to be controlled. When he marched through Ireland in 1149 and imposed peace, the language used by the chroniclers suggests that Dublin had already been brought within his power. As his authority increased, he no longer wanted influence over the city from a distance. He wanted to rule it directly. In 1154 he advanced on Dublin, and the people of the city accepted him as king. In return, he rewarded them on a truly royal scale, granting them 1,200 cows, an enormous gift for the time. This was not a mere transaction. It was the language of kingship, submission, and alliance. Yet Dublin was never easy to hold. Even when brought to heel, it remained a city that required force, negotiation, and repeated demonstrations of strength. A few years later, Mac Lochlainn and his ally, Diarmait Mac Murchada, attacked its territory again, ravaging the lands around it and burning its grain. Mac Lochlainn himself failed to break the city completely, but his ally pressed on and bent the Dubliners to his will, forcing compensation and asserting a level of authority not seen in many years. Then, in 1166, the political map changed with dramatic speed. Mac Lochlainn's power collapsed, and Ruaidhri Ua Conchobair moved quickly to make himself King of Ireland. Dublin again became central to the contest. Its rulers handed over hostages and formally acknowledged him as both King of Ireland and their own lord. The city also joined him in overthrowing Diarmait Mac Murchada, who was driven into exile. That exile would change the history of Ireland. Seeking to recover his position, Mac Murchada turned abroad and returned with a foreign military help. The forces he brought with him were Norman, and their arrival marked the beginning of a new age. First came a sizable group, then larger armies followed. One by one, the Viking port towns fell to these invaders and their Irish allies. Wexford was taken. Waterford fell. Then Dublin itself, after determined resistance, was captured in September 1170. With that fall, Viking Dublin ceased to exist as an independent political power. A long chapter of Irish and Norse history had come to an end. Yet the people of these towns did not vanish overnight. After the conquest, the old Viking cities passed into the hands of the English crown, and over time their inhabitants gradually lost their separate political identity. But this process was slow. The Norse language continued to be spoken in and around Dublin for generations. Even after the Norman conquest, the descendants of the Scandinavian settlers remained distinct enough to be given their own settlement near the city. The merchants of Dublin still had strong reasons to preserve their language and habits. Their prosperity depended on trade with other Scandinavian communities, and they had maintained social, cultural, and commercial links with places like Norway and Iceland for a very long time. For centuries, they had been part of a sea-connected world, and even under new rulers, those older connections did not disappear immediately. Still, in the end, these communities were gradually absorbed into the legal and cultural framework of the English colony in Ireland. For a long time, many scholars described pre-Viking Ireland as a rigid, conservative, and backward society, one that was suddenly transformed only by the arrival of the Scandinavians. This view became deeply influential. According to that older interpretation, the Vikings shattered an old tribal order, introduced towns, stimulated commerce, and pushed Ireland into a more advanced economic age. The contrast was often drawn very sharply. Ireland was imagined as a primitive pastoral world, while the Norse were seen as the bearers of urban life, overseas trade, and change. In this interpretation, the Viking invasions were a turning point that swept away an ancient social order and replaced it with something more dynamic. But that picture is too simple. It tells only part of the story and, in many ways, distorts the world into which the Vikings first arrived. If we want to understand the impact of the Viking Age, we first need to understand the island that existed before the first ships appeared on its shores. That earlier, Ireland was not frozen in time. It was not a society untouched by outside influence. Though it stood on the outer edge of northwestern Europe, it was never truly isolated. Roman Britain had already drawn Ireland into a wider zone of exchange, and through trade, migration and contact, new technologies and new ideas had entered the island. Christianity, which began to spread in late antiquity, brought literacy and stronger links with Britain and the continent. Even before Christianity had fully taken root, some Irish people were probably already familiar with the written culture of the Roman world through trade, mercenary service, and marriage connections. By the 4th and 5th centuries, Irish settlers had begun to establish themselves in Wales, Cornwall, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. Then, through the missionary work associated with figures like Patrick and Palladius, these connections widened and deepened. Irish clergy later moved outward into Britain and the continent, carrying their learning with them and creating new channels of influence in return. The Irish absorbed ideas from the Picts, the Anglo-Saxons, the Franks, and even from the distant Mediterranean world. But they did not merely imitate what they received. Instead, they fused outside influences with native traditions and produced a culture of remarkable originality. The result was the flowering of a brilliant age in the 7th century, often described as a golden age of Irish learning, art, and religious life. This was a confident society, fully aware of its Christian identity, yet unafraid to reshape older traditions for new purposes. Churchmen of the period were capable of using elements of the pagan past without feeling threatened by them. They reworked inherited institutions and legends to support Christian ideas and political arguments. Irish canon law did not only regulate local religious communities. It sought to imagine the order of the Christian world itself. Writers and church leaders were already grappling with how to make society more orderly, more moral, and more unified. One remarkable attempt to reduce the brutality of warfare was the Law of the Innocents, which sought to protect women and children from violence. Another important development was the effort to create a Christian understanding of kingship. Churchmen looked toward the high kingship, centered on Tara as an institution that might rise above the constant fighting of lesser rulers and point towards some form of island-wide authority. The idea of a kingship of all Ireland did not become a reality quickly, but the fact that clerics were already imagining such a possibility in the 7th century shows how far-sighted they were. Far from being locked in a primitive past, they were actively rethinking the future of Irish political order. The major churches of Ireland were central to this process. By the middle of the 7th century, the great ecclesiastical centres were not simply places of prayer. They were major centres of population, wealth, administration, and influence. Armagh, for example, already had distinct internal districts, sacred churches, a mixed population of clergy and laity, lands under sanctuary, and estates stretching far beyond the immediate settlement. It cared for the sick, the poor, abandoned children, and other dependents. It was linked to distant churches and relied on a large body of lay tenants who worked its lands. It also laid claim to the status of Chief Church of Ireland, and as that claim gained acceptance, tribute and gifts flowed toward it from far across the island. This was not a tiny religious enclosure cut off from the world. it was a vast and living centre of power. The same can be said of Kildare, the chief church of Leinster. Its great church, rebuilt in the 7th century, was described as soaring high and richly adorned. Its sacred interior was carefully arranged, with divisions separating men and women and special spaces reserved for the holiest rites. The founders' tombs lay near the altar, marked by splendour and precious decoration. The site was surrounded by sanctuary lands and served as a place of refuge. Royal treasures were kept there in safety. All of this reveals a settlement with a substantial population, ceremonial importance, and close ties to kingship. On great feast days, the population must have swelled further still. It may be going too far to call these church settlements fully developed towns in the 7th century, but they were certainly much more than simple monasteries. They were ceremonial centres, with religious cores, large surrounding populations, tenants, workers, clergy, and dependents all gathered into the family of the saint. Over time, especially during the 9th and 10th centuries, many of these places developed increasingly urban characteristics. They became some of the richest centres in Ireland, and their wealth naturally attracted the attention of kings. A ruler who could dominate one of these sites gained access not only to spiritual prestige but also to labour, food, tribute, and political leverage. These churches were also the main points around which settlement clustered. Long before the Vikings arrived, they were already moving in the direction of becoming towns and large villages. Their great circular enclosures, topped perhaps with palisades and marked by ditches and embankments, must have stood out strongly in the landscape. Around them were houses, workshops, fields, herds, and busy local populations. Young men watched over cattle. Dogs moved among the pasture lands. Travellers, tenants, pilgrims, and church workers would all have passed through these places. They were focal points of everyday life as well as of worship. Beyond the church lands, the wider secular population lived in a countryside structured by lordship, kinship, and agricultural labour. Independent farmers lived in enclosed homesteads, protected by circular banks and ditches. Greater lords displayed their rank by having multiple enclosures around their dwellings. Social ties between lord and follower were often built around the granting of cattle, the core measure of wealth. Those with greater resources owed military service. They accompanied their lords on official journeys, in raids, and in war. Some people lived on artificial lake islands that offered security, though even these were not always safe. In one famous winter, severe frost allowed Viking raiders to cross frozen water and plunder a site that would normally have been protected. Excavations of these lake settlements have revealed much about the lives of those who inhabited them. The landscape itself was a mixture of forest, open farmland, and long settled zones dotted with enclosures. Neighbours and kinsmen often worked together in ploughing, sharing oxen and tools. Although cattle lay at the heart of the economy, grain was also extremely important. Archaeology has shown this very clearly. Horizontal watermills used for grinding grain have been found in impressive numbers. One especially striking example comes from a site where seawater was stored in specially built tanks and then released in a controlled way to power mills. This kind of ingenuity reveals technical knowledge, investment, and organised labour. It does not fit the image of a stagnant or simple economy. Another remarkable discovery has transformed our understanding of early medieval Ireland even further: the remains of a great wooden bridge across the Shannon at Clonmacnoise. Part of it dates to the early 9th century. It was large enough for vehicles, men, and animals to cross. On one side, the bridge could be approached on dry land. On the other, a road had been built for a long distance across bogland. This was not a minor structure. It was a major work of engineering created at a time when Clonmacnoise itself was expanding rapidly. Settlement was spreading toward the river. Land was being raised for houses and workshops. And artistic activity at the site was increasing. Such a project suggests rising population, organised labour, and concentrated resources. It invites us to think seriously of places like Clonmacnoise as monastic towns in the making. Sites like this produce surplus wealth. Their rich artwork, building activity, and infrastructure prove it. Kings wanted control over them for the same reason later rulers wanted Dublin. These were places where troops could be housed, animals pastured, tribute drawn, and influence displayed. For powerful dynasties, major churches became political centres as well as religious ones. Rulers campaigned with their support, placed relatives in abbacies, and tied ecclesiastical wealth to secular expansion. This is not the behaviour of a fragmented and powerless society made up only of petty local chiefs. By the 8th century, large political territories were growing, and lesser rulers were being absorbed into wider structures of power. Many retained the title of king within their local districts, but in practical terms they were increasingly becoming subordinates of stronger overlords. The political struggles of the time were harsh and often bloody. Battles between forces linked to rival churches were rarely just religious disputes. They were usually expressions of dynastic conflict. Entire regional power struggles could revolve around control of ecclesiastical centres. Hundreds died in some of these clashes. At the same time, the 8th century also witnessed a flourishing of art, much of it supported by royal patronage, and concentrated in churches deeply involved in politics. This was a warrior society, and poets celebrated those who died in battle. Yet warfare was not the only hardship people faced. The annals also record years of drought, famine, violent storms, disease, cattle plague, smallpox, dysentery, and other disasters. The world into which the Vikings came was not peaceful or simple. It was active, ambitious, and deeply strained by both human conflict and environmental crisis. In the closing decades of the 8th century, a more intense spiritual movement also emerged within the Irish Church. Those who called themselves the servants of God preached a stricter and more disciplined religious life. They sought purity, fasting, chastity, and reform, often distancing themselves from the older monastic order. New communities were founded, especially in the region around present-day Dublin. These reformers established fresh centres of devotion and also inserted themselves into older ecclesiastical settlements. Until the middle of the 9th century, this movement gave new energy to the church. But then, into this tense, creative and troubled society, the Viking attacks fell. The shock was profound. It can be felt not only in the annals but also in the great books of the time. When Iona was burned and its community slaughtered, the survivors sought refuge and began the building of a new sacred centre at Kells. The alliance between major churches was marked in stone and ritual. At the same time, in Armagh, a great manuscript was being written. Within it appears a remarkable image of the heavenly Jerusalem, the holy city of the Apocalypse. Nearby in the text, a note names the abbot of Iona, who had just fled the destruction. The meaning is powerful. Faced with violence and ruin, the churchmen of Ireland turned to the imagery of the New Jerusalem, the city of God descending into a broken world. That same spiritual imagination seems to lie behind the creation of the Book of Kells and the building of the new church at Kells. The new foundation was not simply another monastery. It was conceived as a sacred city, a kind of earthly temple. Irish thinkers of the 9th century often described their great church settlements in terms that made them resemble holy cities. The inner sacred core, where saints rested and the holiest rites were performed, was surrounded by layers of sanctity. Different zones had different levels of holiness, and penalties applied to those who crossed into spaces they were not entitled to enter. Ordinary people gathered in the outer areas, while the clergy approached the inner sacred centre. It was also in these outer spaces that signs of market life begin to appear more clearly from the 8th century onward. These were populous settlements, organised, active, wealthy, and increasingly complex. And that is why the Vikings targeted them. They did not descend upon a deserted or primitive island. They found a country already full of ceremonial centres, monastic hubs, political rivalries, engineering works, expanding settlements, trade activity, and powerful kings who were struggling to dominate both sacred and secular wealth. The church towns of Ireland were among the richest and most visible places in the landscape, and so they became the first great prizes of the Viking Age. What followed was not the sudden awakening of a backward society by outside force. It was the collision of two vigorous worlds, each capable of violence, adaptation, and ambition, and the result would reshape Ireland forever. What truly shocked the people of Ireland was not Viking violence itself. They had known violence for centuries. Raids, battles, and destruction were already part of their world. What stunned them was something deeper, something almost unthinkable: the violation of what they saw as sacred space. The churches were not just buildings, they were the heart of society, the spiritual centre, the place where heaven seemed closest to earth. When the Vikings began pushing their attacks right up to the doors of these holy places, something changed. A line had been crossed. In earlier conflicts, even rival Irish kings often showed a degree of restraint toward the inner sacred core of a church settlement. But now, that protection was gone. People rushed into churches seeking safety, believing they would be spared. Instead, they often found themselves trapped, gathered together in one place, becoming easy targets for capture. What was meant to be sanctuary became a place of vulnerability, feeding directly into the growing slave trade. In the early phase, Viking attacks were limited. They struck the coasts, appearing and disappearing with the seasons. But over time, they adapted. They learned the land, the rivers, the weaknesses. By the year 837, their numbers had grown large enough to stay through the winter. Ireland, though harsh at times, offered a milder environment than the far north they had come from. They observed carefully. They saw that livestock was not always sheltered in winter, that resources could be taken even in colder months. As they settled, took wives, and kept slaves, something else began to happen. They started to absorb Irish ways of life. They learned how to build with local materials, how to farm the land, how to raise animals suited to the environment. They learned the language, but this was not a one-sided process. The Irish also learned from them. New ship technologies, new fishing methods, and even elements of Norse art began to spread. Words related to the sea entered the Irish language. Cultural exchange followed conflict, and over time, even religion became a shared space. The term once used to describe the Vikings as pagans gradually faded, reflecting a slow but steady process of conversion and integration. So did the Vikings completely transform Irish society? Not entirely, but they accelerated changes that were already underway. They acted as a catalyst, pushing developments forward more rapidly and more intensely. Both societies were evolving at the same time, influencing one another in complex ways. Despite the violence of the 9th century, the great monastic centres of Ireland did not disappear. Instead, they endured, adapted, and remained powerful. Irish kings, in fact, became stronger during this period. Some of them directly participated in the slave trade alongside the Vikings, gaining wealth and silver in the process. Warfare grew more brutal and more frequent. Certain Irish groups even began to behave like Viking raiders themselves, establishing their own bases until they were destroyed by rival kings. Alliances between Irish rulers and Viking leaders became common. In one case, an Irish king joined forces with the Norse to attack his own rivals, burning churches and killing hundreds. These were not simple divisions between Irish and Viking. They were shifting alliances driven by ambition, survival, and power. As strategies developed to resist the Vikings, Irish society itself became more militarized. Small communities were gradually absorbed into larger political units. Powerful kings extended their reach, building stronger and more centralized authority. The old independent farmers, who once lived in enclosed homesteads, slowly became part of a broader system, paying rent and supporting their lords. Settlements changed as well. People increasingly lived in more open farming communities, producing food to support military elites. Society was becoming more structured, more hierarchical, and more focused on organized power. Then came another major transformation. By the 10th century, new types of settlements began to emerge. True trading towns. Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick became hubs of international commerce. At first, they had been targets for raids, but gradually Irish rulers realised that controlling these towns was far more profitable than destroying them. Instead of attacking them, they began to tax them. These cities connected Ireland to a vast trading network stretching across the Irish Sea and beyond. Wealth flowed through them, and with that wealth came influence. By this stage, the Vikings were no longer outsiders. They were becoming part of Irish political life. Their leaders sometimes acted like Irish kings, and their cities were woven into the power struggles of the island. There are clear signs of this integration. In one raid, a Viking leader chose to spare churches and hospitals, something that would have been unthinkable in earlier generations. Another ruler, once a powerful king of Dublin, ended his life in religious retreat, seeking forgiveness and peace. The same monastic communities that had once been devastated by Viking attacks now played a role in converting them to Christianity. Over time, the descendants of the raiders became traders, craftsmen, shipbuilders, and mercenaries. One of the largest Viking ships ever discovered was built in Ireland, a powerful symbol of how deeply these cultures had merged. At the same time, the physical shape of Viking towns began to take form. Archaeology reveals that these towns were not random collections of houses. They were carefully planned spaces. Dublin and other settlements were divided into plots, separated by fences and pathways. Streets followed the natural shape of the land, often running along ridges or slopes. Houses were built facing inward toward their own plots rather than directly onto the streets. Pathways connected homes to main roads, and movement through the town was controlled and organized. Over time, these layouts remained surprisingly stable, lasting for generations. Different parts of the town developed their own character. Some areas were crowded with small buildings and workshops, while others contained larger structures that may have belonged to wealthier inhabitants. Certain crafts were concentrated in specific zones. Metalworkers, leatherworkers, traders, and artisans all had their own spaces. This suggests not only economic activity, but also a level of urban organization and authority. Someone was controlling the layout, maintaining order, and regulating property. Taxes were even imposed based on individual plots, showing that these towns had developed systems of ownership and administration. The locations of these Viking towns were chosen with great care. They were usually built on slightly elevated ground overlooking river estuaries, where tidal waters met inland routes. This gave them direct access to both sea and land. From these positions, they could launch ships, control trade, and defend themselves more easily. Natural features like rivers, marshes, and slopes were used as part of their defences, reducing the need for massive construction. These choices were not accidental. They reflect a deep understanding of strategy, trade, and survival. This approach to settlement was different from that of earlier Irish monastic centres. While monasteries were often placed for symbolic or territorial reasons, Viking towns were positioned for control, defence, and commerce. They were gateways between the sea and the interior, linking Ireland to a wider world. Over time, they grew beyond their original boundaries. Houses appeared outside the defensive lines, and the towns expanded. What began as fortified camps slowly became permanent urban centres. These towns were busy places. Narrow lanes connected plots, pathways led through yards, and goods moved constantly through the streets. There may have been markets, gatherings, and daily trade. While the archaeological record does not show every detail, it is clear that these were living, dynamic environments. People worked, traded, built, and adapted. The structure of the town reflected both necessity and opportunity. As Viking settlements in Ireland grew into permanent towns, they also had to become places that could defend themselves. These were no longer temporary camps or exposed harbours where ships simply came and went. They were becoming political centres, commercial hubs, and military strongholds. Archaeology shows this very clearly. In towns such as Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, the people who lived there invested heavily in defences, building earthworks, ditches, embankments, and later stone walls. These defences were not crude barriers thrown up in panic. They developed over time, becoming larger, stronger, and more sophisticated as the towns themselves expanded. The story of these fortifications tells us something important. The Hiberno-Norse towns of Ireland were not accidental settlements. They were planned, protected places, shaped by danger, trade, and long-term ambition. Dublin offers the clearest and most dramatic evidence. In its earlier form, the town was enclosed by an earthen bank, probably during the 10th century. Later, as the settlement grew and its needs changed, a larger, outer line of defence was built around it in the 11th century. Over time, this second bank was enlarged, reinforced, and improved, especially with the addition of layers of mud taken from the estuary. At some stage, stonework was added in front of these earth defences. In some places, this may have begun as reinforcement, but in others, it seems to have become a proper town wall in its own right. By this point, Dublin was no longer simply a defended camp. It had become a fortified urban centre surrounded by serious protective works. The excavations at Fishamble Street in Dublin reveal this process in remarkable detail. Along the south bank of the River Liffey, archaeologists uncovered a sequence of waterfront structures stretching across different phases of the town's life. Among them were flood barriers, defensive embankments, and eventually a stone wall. The earliest banks were low and practical rather than military. They seem to have been built more to keep nearby land dry than to stop attackers. They stood above the high water line and do not appear to have carried heavy timber palisades. Their purpose was likely to protect the sloping ground behind them, where signs of human activity and discarded material had already begun to accumulate. But later, during the 10th century, the people of Dublin constructed something much more formidable. A major embankment was built along the high water line, probably as part of a unified plan and likely under royal direction. It was laid over earlier dumped refuse, marked out by pre-existing boundaries, and protected from the force of the tidal river by a breakwater cut into the rocky foreshore. This first real defensive bank was no minor feature. It was accompanied in places by a ditch cut into the limestone outside it. Along its outer slope, a line of planks had been set side by side, perhaps to create a smooth slipway where ships could be drawn up, or perhaps as part of a defensive timber structure. Whatever the exact purpose of these planks, the whole arrangement suggests careful engineering and a close relationship between defence and maritime activity. The town wall, was not simply a barrier against enemies on land. It was also tied to ships, the river, and the waterfront economy of Viking Dublin. This embankment seems to have enclosed the whole settlement. Not long after, that first bank was replaced by an even larger one. The second embankment appears to have been built around the year 1000 and was erected in several stages. It reused parts of the earlier structure but pushed farther outward toward the river. Its construction was complex. Layers of gravel, stone, and earth were laid down, reinforced with discarded timber screens and brushwood. At one point, it carried a post and wattle palisade. Later, when the bank was raised higher, this was replaced by a stronger timber wall anchored from behind. In its final form, the entire bank was covered in estuarine mud brought up from the riverbed. Once dried, this created a firm and durable outer surface. This second great embankment also seems to have surrounded the whole town. Evidence for it has been found not only at the riverfront but also in other parts of Dublin, including areas near the later castle and along the line of the Poddle. Before the next stage of development, it may even have been raised still higher. For much of the Hiberno-Norse period, Dublin may have remained enclosed primarily by these massive earthen defences. But by the end of the 11th century, something new appeared: a stone wall. This was a significant step. The wall was about 1.5 metres thick and in places may originally have stood as high as 3.5 metres. More than 100 metres of it were uncovered in excavation. It was built with a rubble core held between mortared stone faces, and the way it was constructed suggests both skill and careful planning. It may not always have stood entirely free from the bank behind it, but even if part revetment and part wall, it was a major urban defence. Its discovery in more than one part of the city strongly suggests that it encircled Dublin as a whole. This may help explain why Dublin's fortress was admired in contemporary writing as one of the wonders of Ireland. A stone wall of this kind would have been impressive, new, and striking in the Irish landscape. Waterford seems to have gone through a similar process, though with its own local rhythm. There too, an earthen bank was built only after the town had expanded, probably well into the 11th century. Excavation revealed a substantial bank, accompanied by a deep ditch. The bank itself was made of turf and clay, built in sections, and was large enough to require coordinated labour from groups of workers operating under some central authority. Timber beams may have formed part of its upper structure, hinting that a wooden superstructure once crowned the earthwork. Then, in the 12th century, this bank was replaced by a strong stone wall built against its eastern side. Like the Dublin wall, it had a rubble core and was built in sections, showing vertical joins between working teams. It also had a path running outside it. Waterford even produced rare evidence for a town gate from before the Norman period. At Peter Street, part of a gateway, built into the wall, was uncovered, complete with dressed stone sides rising above projecting bases. This is an extraordinary glimpse into the urban architecture of a Hiberno-Norse town. Limerick also shows evidence of serious defences. There, traces of a clay bank faced with limestone were found, together with a pathway and a deep ditch. These features may represent part of a major stone-faced earthen rampart, perhaps dating to the 12th century. Later, Norman builders reused parts of this earlier defence when constructing their own fortifications, which tells us that the original Viking or Hiberno-Norse structure was strong and substantial enough to remain useful even after conquest. Wexford is less clear archaeologically, but later written evidence strongly suggests that it too possessed a stone wall by the time of the Norman arrival. Even if the surviving physical traces are less certain, the pattern is clear. These were defended towns, and by the later Hiberno-Norse period, stone walls had become part of their identity. Yet the walls were only one part of the urban story. Inside these defended spaces stood the buildings that made daily life possible. These towns were not filled with one single kind of structure. Archaeologists have identified several different building forms, and together they reveal a world of homes, storage spaces, workshops, small huts, and more ambitious constructions. Some forms were widespread across several towns, while others seem to have been more local. But taken together, they show that a recognisable Hiberno-Norse urban building tradition existed in Ireland. The most common building type, by far, was a long, rectangular timber structure found especially in Dublin but also appearing in other towns, such as Waterford and Wexford. This was the classic house of the Hiberno-Norse town. It had low walls of post and wattle, and its roof was carried not by the outer walls but by strong internal posts placed inside the structure. A hearth usually stood in the middle, and doors were often placed at either end. Running along the interior were raised side areas that functioned as benches or sleeping spaces, while a central strip connected the entrances. These houses were practical, sturdy, and efficient. Most were not small huts. Many covered around 40 square meters, and some were much larger. Their repeated appearance over many phases of settlement suggests that they were the standard urban dwelling of Viking and Hiberno-Norse Ireland. Another type of building was smaller and less formal. These structures had rounded corners, side entrances, and usually lacked a proper hearth. Their floors were sometimes covered with woven mats, and they seem to have accompanied the larger main houses rather than replacing them. They may have served as ancillary buildings, perhaps for storage, work, or more specialised domestic use. A third type seems to have been a narrowed and shortened version of the main house, adapted for awkward or cramped plots in parts of Dublin where street lines, or plot shapes, demanded a different plan. Even this tells us something important. The builders of these towns were adapting house design to fit urban conditions. This was not rural building transplanted unchanged into a town. It was architecture responding to streets, property lines, and limited space. Another important category includes sunken featured buildings, structures with floors set below ground level. These appear in Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, though not yet in every town. Some of the earliest examples in Dublin were fairly light constructions cut into the edge of the foreshore. Later versions in other towns were more substantial, with strong timbers, carefully formed entrances and, in some cases, foundations that suggest an upper floor may once have existed above the sunken lower space. In some places, these buildings may have been used for storage rather than residence. They seem to represent a building tradition that changed over time, moving from simpler sunken structures toward more urban, cellar-like forms with upper rooms above. Whatever their exact purpose, they were clearly a recurring part of Hiberno-Norse urban life. Smaller huts and pens also appear in the archaeological record. These were simple sub-rectangular structures, often placed behind the main buildings. They were probably used as sheds, animal pens, privies, or small workspaces. They remind us that town life involved much more than just houses and streets. These were working environments where tools, animals, goods, and waste all had to be managed within confined plots. By the 11th and 12th centuries, improved carpentry techniques also began to change building styles. In Waterford especially, new kinds of houses appeared using sill beams and more advanced timber construction. These buildings had load-bearing outer walls rather than heavy internal roof supports, and their wall construction suggests something closer to a framed structure. This was a significant step forward. The newer methods did not always completely transform the shape of the building, but they allowed greater flexibility, stronger walls, and possibly new internal arrangements. These houses mark an important stage in the development of urban architecture in Ireland, and they show that Hiberno-Norse towns were not frozen in a single style. They were evolving. Stone buildings also begin to appear. In Waterford, a rectangular stone structure from the later Hiberno-Norse period had substantial walls, a preserved wooden floor, and evidence that it may once have supported an upper level. This is a major development. Stone had long been used in churches in Ireland, so the material itself was familiar. But its use in secular town buildings marks a shift in urban form and ambition. Stone town walls and stone churches were already transforming the appearance of places like Dublin and Waterford. Now, secular architecture was beginning to follow. These stone buildings did not yet dominate the towns, which remained largely timber-built, thatched, and low in profile, but they point toward the next stage in urban development. What emerges from all of this is a clear picture. The Viking and Hiberno-Norse towns of Ireland shared a common physical character. They were usually built in strategic, riverine, and estuarine locations, protected by earthworks and later stone walls, divided into organised plots, and filled with a recognisable family of buildings. In that sense, there really was such a thing as the Hiberno-Norse town. It was not just Dublin in isolation. Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Limerick, and probably Cork belonged to the same broader urban tradition. At the same time, these towns were not simply copies of settlements in England or Scandinavia. They had links with both worlds, of course. York in particular shows strong parallels to Dublin in location, defence, and some building forms, and the dynastic connections between Dublin and York are well known. But most English towns of the period retained older Roman inheritances or Anglo-Saxon street plans, while Scandinavian towns often developed very different building traditions, including log-built houses and other northern styles that are not typical of Ireland. The Hiberno-Norse towns were something distinct. They were shaped by Irish geography, Irish materials, Irish political realities, and the interaction of Norse settlers with an already rich native landscape of monasteries, kingdoms, and power centres. That is what makes them so important. They were not foreign implants that remained unchanged, nor were they simply native settlements with a few Scandinavian touches. They were new creations born from contact, conflict, adaptation, and exchange. Their walls, streets, plots, and houses reflect that mixed world. They belong to the Irish landscape, but they also opened Ireland more fully to the wider seaborne world of the North Atlantic. In their defences we can see fear, ambition, and organisation. In their buildings we can see everyday life, innovation, and continuity. And in their overall form we can see one of the most lasting Viking contributions to Irish history: the emergence of a distinct urban tradition that would survive long after the Viking Age itself had passed. The first Viking attacks recorded in Ireland came in 795, and for decades afterward, the pattern was one of scattered, irregular violence. Ships appeared, monasteries or coastal settlements were struck, wealth was taken, and then the raiders disappeared again. For a long time, these attacks were seasonal and limited, but they were only the beginning. By the early 840s, the Scandinavian presence had changed in a fundamental way. The Vikings were no longer just arriving to plunder and leave. They began to establish permanent fortified bases along the coasts and waterways of Ireland. These bases, known as long forts, allowed them to hold territory, shelter fleets, store loot, and launch further expeditions deep into the country. Of all these early strongholds, none would become more important than the settlement at Dublin. The decades that followed were among the most dangerous of the Viking Age in Ireland. This was the phase of larger fleets, heavier attacks, and what may have been genuine attempts at conquest. The Scandinavians appear for a time to have tested whether Ireland might be taken in the same way that parts of England and Scotland were taken. They raided widely, built bases, and tried to force open political and military space for settlement. But Ireland proved harder to master than they may have expected. The local kings resisted fiercely, and although the Vikings achieved spectacular victories and secured important enclaves, they failed to impose lasting control over broad inland territories. By the later 9th century, Scandinavian settlement seems to have remained concentrated in a number of coastal and river-based strongholds, along with the surrounding lands that supported them. Yet these strongholds were not only military camps. Over time, several of them began to function as centres of trade as well as raiding. Wealth gathered in them on a remarkable scale. Dublin, in particular, became a place where silver, slaves, goods, and influence accumulated in large quantities. The scale of that wealth is suggested by famous silver finds from across the Viking world. One great hoard discovered in northwestern England seems to contain a major portion of silver that had likely been gathered in the Dublin Longfort during the late 9th century. That detail alone tells us something important. Even before the rise of true towns, these early Viking bases in Ireland were already becoming powerful economic centres. From the middle of the 9th century onward, the Scandinavians became more and more involved in Irish politics. They were no longer simply external attackers. They became allies, mercenaries, rivals, and political actors inside the struggles of Irish kings. Again and again, they fought beside one ruler against another, lending ships, warriors, and military weight to internal conflicts. This integration changed the nature of Viking activity in Ireland. By the early 10th century, the Scandinavians may well have recognised that they were unlikely to carve out large agricultural kingdoms there on the English model. Ireland's political landscape was too fragmented, too resilient, and too difficult to dominate in that way. So instead, they appear to have moved toward a different strategy. One based not on conquering the island outright, but on controlling it economically. That shift was decisive. Rather than simply raiding Ireland, the Scandinavians began building a new kind of future within it. They founded trading towns, among them Dublin, Limerick, and Cork, and these settlements gradually became central to the economy and politics of the island. Over time, they were woven into the framework of local kingdoms. They were not outside the Irish world anymore. They became accepted, contested, and deeply important parts of it. These new towns turned into prosperous centres of exchange, places where power, money, and goods moved in and out of Ireland on an international scale. During the 10th century, Dublin in particular became more than a port. It emerged as one of the most significant commercial centres in the Irish Sea world, deeply involved in both regional politics and overseas trade. The Scandinavian experience in Ireland was different from what had happened elsewhere, and that difference came from the nature of Ireland itself. The Vikings did not arrive in a political vacuum. They entered a land with its own structures of kingship, wealth, religion, and social organisation. Because of those conditions, the Scandinavian response in Ireland developed in a distinctive way. The rise of towns was one part of that response. In places like Scandinavian Scotland, towns of this kind did not emerge in the same way. In Ireland, however, urban foundations became one of the defining outcomes of the Viking presence. Alongside this came the growth of a commercially oriented economy, one increasingly tied to silver. Given that kind of economy, it is no surprise that Ireland has produced such large quantities of Viking Age silver. It is also no surprise that the silver working tradition, developed there by the Hiberno Scandinavians, became one of the most important in the Viking West. The silver hoards of Viking Age Ireland are among the most remarkable in Europe. More than 130 hoards of Scandinavian or Hiberno Scandinavian character have been found there. an extraordinary concentration of wealth. Even if we look only at the 9th and 10th centuries, the number remains exceptional. These hoards are not all alike. Some contain only non-coined silver, such as ornaments, ingots, or cut fragments of silver known as hack silver. Others combine such material with coins, still others consist only of coins. Taken together, they reveal not just accumulated treasure, but the working of an economy in which silver circulated by weight, was cut up when necessary, melted down, remade, stored, exchanged, and buried. Roughly half of the Irish hoards from this period belong to the non-coin category. These are especially important because many of them are dominated by ornaments of Hiberno-Scandinavian type. Among the most characteristic items are broad band arm rings, one of the signature silver forms of Viking Age Ireland. These heavy rings, often made from broad, flat silver bands and decorated with stamped patterns, appear again and again in Irish finds. Their date range suggests that many of these hoards belong to the century between about 850 and 950. In other words, they belong to the age before the full coin economy of the towns had taken hold. This was still a bullion world where silver circulated not just as money in the narrow sense, but as wearable wealth, stored value and raw material for trade. These non-coin hoards themselves fall into different patterns. Some contain only complete ornaments, often just a handful of them, with no ingots and no chopped fragments. Others include ingots with or without ornaments, but still no hack silver. A third group includes hack silver, often cut from ornaments or ingots, and in many cases ingots as well. These distinctions matter because they show different uses of silver in circulation. Some hoards seem to preserve wealth in finished and recognizable form. Others show silver already being prepared for use by weight, ready to be broken down and exchanged. Together, they reveal a lively bullion economy in which silver was valued not for royal images stamped on coins, but for what it weighed and what it could become. Mixed hoards form another revealing category. These contain coins alongside ingots, ornaments, or hack silver, and most of them belong to the 10th century. They represent a transitional phase. In them, we can see a world moving from a purely bullion-based economy toward one in which coins were beginning to matter more. Yet even here, silver was still not restricted to coin. Ingots and cut fragments remained important. Some of these mixed hoards are especially striking, with large numbers of ingots and fragmented ornaments buried alongside a smaller number of coins. They show that even when coined silver entered circulation, it joined an existing system rather than replacing it immediately. Hoards made up entirely of coins are actually a smaller part of the overall silver wealth of Viking Age Ireland. There are many such finds, but most are modest in size compared with the great bullion hoards. Most were buried after about 940, and the coins they contain are mainly Anglo-Saxon, though coins from the Islamic world, from Viking rulers in England, and later from Hiberno-Norse mints, also appear. By the 11th century, locally produced coins had become increasingly important, especially after Dublin established its own mint. This marks the final shift from a bullion economy toward a more coin-centred commercial world. The distribution of these hoards across Ireland also tells an important story. The non-coin hoards are spread widely, though there is a notable concentration in the central Midlands. Mixed and coin hoards are more heavily focused on the East Coast and the Midlands. One striking fact stands out. Many of these hoards were buried in areas not directly settled or politically controlled by the Scandinavians. That suggests that very large amounts of silver ended up in Irish hands. The Irish were not merely victims of Viking wealth extraction. They were participants in a system of exchange, tribute, alliance, and profit. Exactly how they acquired this silver is not always easy to determine, but trade must have played a major role, alongside payments, political gifts, and negotiated relationships between Irish rulers and Scandinavian towns or warbands. If we step back and look at the changing character of the hordes over time, the broader economic transformation becomes visible. In the late 9th and early 10th centuries, the dominant pattern is the bullion economy of ornaments, ingots, and hack silver. Then come the mixed hordes, representing a world in transition, where coins are entering circulation, but bullion still matters deeply. Finally, from the middle of the 10th century onward, the importance of coin hordes rises sharply, while purely bullion hordes decline. By the start of the 11th century, this transition is essentially complete. The foundation of a mint in Dublin helped to cement this new phase. What we are seeing is not just a change in the contents of buried treasures. We are seeing the formation of a new economic order. Yet the greatest quantities of silver appear to have entered Ireland before that coin-based order was fully established. Analysis of the non-coin and mixed hordes suggests that the main period of silver importation falls between about 850 and 950. This is a crucial point. It means that large amounts of silver were flowing into Ireland long before the urban economy of the later 10th and 11th centuries had fully matured. Since relatively little imported silver from this earlier period survives, in easily identifiable foreign forms, it seems likely that much of it was being melted down soon after arrival. Coins, ornaments, and ingots from abroad were turned into the characteristic products of Hiberno-Scandinavian craftsmanship. This tells us not only that Ireland received silver in abundance, but that it possessed skilled workshops capable of transforming imported metal into a local style. The centre of this silver working tradition was Dublin, though the towns of Munster also played a smaller role. The sheer quantity of locally made Hiberno-Scandinavian ornaments found in Irish hoards shows how strong and active this tradition was. It also raises a major question. Where exactly did all that silver come from? Some answers lie in the imported objects and coins that do survive. A small but significant number of hoards contain objects that can be traced back to Scandinavia and the Baltic. These include fragments of brooches, spiral rings, arm rings, and other items of northern or eastern origin. The number of such pieces is limited, but they are likely only the visible remnant of a much larger flow of silver objects that were routinely melted down after reaching Ireland. What is especially striking is that many of these imported objects point not toward Norway, but towards southern Scandinavia and the Baltic world. This is important because the same region was also the source through which large quantities of Arabic silver entered the Viking economy. Islamic silver coins, especially those of Kufic type, were highly valued in Viking Scandinavia because of their reliable weight and silver purity. They moved northward along the trade routes of Eastern Europe, passed through the Baltic and Scandinavian worlds, and then continued westward. In Ireland and Britain, Arabic coins appear in a number of hoards, especially around the Irish Sea Zone. Their presence suggests that Ireland was linked, however indirectly, to vast trade networks stretching all the way back toward the Islamic world. In Ireland, Arabic coins occur more often in hoards that also contain non-coin silver than in hoards of coins alone. That may indicate that they belong to the same circulation as ingots and ornaments. In other words, they were not simply being saved as coinage, they were entering a bullion system, and at least some of them were likely melted down and recycled into local products. The same probably happened with silver coins from Anglo-Saxon England, from Viking rulers in England, and from the Carolingian world. Unfortunately, scientific analysis of Irish Viking Age silver is still limited, so the full picture cannot yet be reconstructed with certainty. But the evidence we do have suggests that the silver supply in Ireland was mixed, drawing on several sources at once: Arabic coin, Anglo-Saxon coin, and non-numismatic silver from Scandinavia and the Baltic. Even more revealing is the fact that although Anglo-Saxon silver helped supply the raw metal, Anglo-Saxon decorative influence seems to have had little effect on the main Hiberno-Scandinavian silver style. That is probably because Anglo-Saxon silver arrived mainly as coin, while Scandinavian and Baltic silver also arrived in ornament form. It was these imported northern ornaments that helped shape local design. And nowhere is this more visible than in the broad band arm ring, the most characteristic product of Hiberno-Scandinavian silver working. These arm rings dominate the ornament record of Viking Age Ireland. They are usually open-ended, formed from broad silver bands that taper toward the ends, and decorated with rows of stamped grooves and often a marked central motif. More than 100 examples are known from Ireland, and they also appear in Britain and Norway, especially in hoards with strong Hiberno-Scandinavian connections. Their dates suggest that they were produced from the second half of the 9th century into the early 10th. Everything about them suggests local manufacture, probably centred on Dublin. They were not merely decorative. They seem to have functioned as a practical means of storing and circulating silver by weight. Their manufacture appears to reflect a target weight standard, though not a rigid one. In trade, they would still have needed to be weighed. And because bullion economies required flexible silver, these rings were often cut into fragments and turned into hack silver, ready for exchange. The origins of this arm ring type seem to lie not in Ireland itself, but in 9th century Denmark. Rings from Danish hoards show striking similarities in form and decoration. Certain motifs and punch patterns seen on the Irish rings closely match those found on southern Scandinavian material. This suggests that Danish examples acted as prototypes for the Hiberno-Scandinavian series. Some individual finds in Ireland and Britain may even represent imported Danish originals, or close copies of them. If that is correct, then one of the most important silver forms of Viking Age Ireland was inspired by design traditions coming through Denmark and the Baltic sphere. That conclusion carries wider significance. Historically, the Scandinavian presence in Ireland has often been associated more strongly with Norwegians than with Danes. Yet, in the world of silver working, southern Scandinavia and the Baltic seem to have mattered more than Norway. That raises major questions about trade routes, supply networks, and the wider cultural connections of Viking Age Ireland. It suggests that the making of Hiberno-Scandinavian wealth was tied into a world much larger than the Irish Sea alone. It also forces us to think again about the early long forts of the 9th century. If so much silver was already circulating in Ireland, before the true urban centres of the 10th century were fully developed, then those early bases must be re-evaluated. They were not just raiding camps. They may already have been active hubs of trade, exchange, storage, and craft production. The silver economy of Viking Age Ireland appears to begin not in the mature towns alone, but in the violent, uncertain world of the long forts. That makes them far more important than they have sometimes been allowed to seem. When we imagine the Vikings in Ireland, we often picture raids, ships, and burning monasteries. But another kind of evidence tells a quieter, more personal story: the graves they left behind. These burials reveal not just how the Vikings lived, but how they understood death, identity, and status in a foreign land. In Ireland, Viking graves can be recognised by the way people were buried and by the objects placed beside them. These customs clearly reflect Scandinavian traditions, especially those practised during the 9th and 10th centuries. Across the Viking world, burial practices were not uniform. There was no single way to bury the dead. But one pattern appears again and again. Individuals of status were often laid to rest with objects that represented their role in life. Men were frequently buried with weapons. Women were often buried with jewellery and tools connected to daily life. These furnished graves appear across the British Isles, from the far north of Scotland down into England and across to Ireland. Yet Ireland stands out for a simple reason. Before the arrival of the Vikings, burial with grave goods was almost unknown there. This makes Viking graves highly visible in the archaeological record. They are something new, something foreign, something unmistakably different. The distribution of these graves across the region tells an important story. Rather than being scattered evenly, they form a broad arc stretching from Norway's western coast through the northern and western Isles of Scotland and into the Irish Sea world. This pattern reflects the maritime routes used by Viking traders and settlers. Ships moved along these routes carrying goods, people, and ideas, and burial customs travelled with them. In Ireland, the concentration of these graves aligns closely with known areas of Scandinavian settlement, especially along the eastern coast. What makes Ireland unique, however, is not just where these graves are found, but how they are grouped. In many parts of Britain and Scotland, Viking graves are often isolated, single burials. In Ireland, the situation is almost the opposite. The overwhelming majority are concentrated around Dublin. This tells us something crucial. Dublin was not just a trading centre or a military base. It was the heart of a Scandinavian community, large enough to sustain its own burial grounds over generations. Two sites in particular dominate this picture: Kilmainham and Islandbridge. Together, they form the largest concentration of Viking burials in Western Europe, outside of Scandinavia itself. At Kilmainham alone, dozens of burials have been identified, most of them belonging to men, but with a small number of women as well. Islandbridge, located not far away, represents a second, slightly smaller cemetery. Together, these sites reveal a settled population, not just passing raiders. They show families, communities, and individuals who lived and died in Ireland, not merely visitors who came and went. Beyond Dublin, Viking graves become much rarer. A handful appear along the northeast coast, in places like Antrim and Down, suggesting a Scandinavian presence in that region as well. A few isolated graves appear inland or along the western coast, but these are exceptions. The overall pattern is clear. Dublin was the centre of Viking life in Ireland, and its burial grounds reflect that dominance. The objects found in these graves allow us to look even closer. In many cases, the human remains themselves were poorly recorded or lost entirely, especially in earlier discoveries. What survived were the grave goods. These objects, preserved in the soil, tell us who these people were. Women's graves are often identified by a distinctive item: oval brooches. These were typically worn in pairs at the shoulders, holding garments in place. They are one of the clearest markers of Scandinavian identity in burial. In Ireland, these brooches appear in only a limited number of styles, and they show little sign of local influence. This suggests that they were brought directly from Scandinavia, perhaps worn by women who had travelled to Ireland themselves. Their presence hints at migration, not just raiding. These were not temporary visitors. These were people building lives far from home. Other items found with women include strings of beads, chains, and tools related to textile production. Objects like spindle whorls, needle cases, and smoothing tools point to the importance of cloth making in daily life. Even in death, these women were buried with the tools of their craft, suggesting that identity and status were closely tied to everyday roles. Men's graves tell a different story. Here, the most common objects are weapons. Swords, spears, and shields dominate the finds. The sword in particular stands out as a symbol of status. It was not just a weapon, but a prized possession, often finely made and carefully maintained. The fact that so many swords have been found in burial contexts suggests that they were not casually lost or discarded. They were deliberately placed in the grave, marking the individual as a warrior. Spears are also common, often found alongside swords. Axes appear less frequently, despite their later association with Scandinavian warriors. Shield bosses, the central metal fittings of shields, are also regularly found, indicating that full sets of weapons may have accompanied some burials. Together, these items create a clear image. The male graves of Viking Age Ireland often represent warriors, men whose identity was tied to combat, status, and reputation. Yet not all graves were richly furnished. In fact, most Viking burials in Ireland contain only a few objects, sometimes just a single weapon or a pair of brooches. This is striking, especially when we consider the wealth of Viking Age Ireland. The scarcity of grave goods is unlikely to reflect poverty. Instead, it may point to cultural change. As Christianity spread through Ireland, its influence began to shape burial practices. Christian tradition discouraged the inclusion of objects in graves. Even among Scandinavian settlers, this influence may have led to simpler burials over time. Beyond weapons and jewellery, other objects occasionally appear. Tools, knives, scales, and weights suggest involvement in craft and trade. Some graves even contain gaming pieces, hinting at leisure and social life. These small details help bring these individuals to life. They were not just warriors or settlers. They were craftspeople, traders, and members of a complex society. The burial rituals themselves offer further clues. In some cases, animals were included in the grave. The most dramatic examples involve horses buried alongside humans. This practice, known from Scandinavia, symbolised status and perhaps the journey to the afterlife. In Ireland, such burials are rare, but they do occur. More common are smaller deposits of animal remains, such as bones or teeth. These may represent food offerings or symbolic gestures tied to belief systems that are now difficult to fully understand. Most Viking burials in Ireland were inhumations, meaning the body was placed intact in the ground. This was the dominant practice, especially around Dublin. However, there is some evidence that cremation also occurred, although much less frequently. In Scandinavia, both methods were used, but in Ireland, the strong influence of Christian tradition may have discouraged cremation. As a result, burial practices in Viking Age Ireland reflect a blend of traditions, Scandinavian in origin, but gradually shaped by the surrounding Irish world. One of the clearest signs that Scandinavian settlers in Ireland were changing under local influence can be seen in the way they buried their dead. In the wider Viking world, especially in places like the Western Isles of Scotland, there was a strong tendency to place important burials inside mounds, sometimes newly raised, and sometimes cut into much older, prehistoric barrows. These mounds gave death a visible presence in the landscape. They connected the dead to memory, ancestry, and display. But in Ireland, that pattern is almost entirely absent. There is no convincing evidence for true Viking burial mounds built in the Irish landscape, and only a couple of uncertain cases where a Scandinavian grave may have been inserted into an older mound. Even those examples are doubtful. What seems much clearer is that the Scandinavian population in Ireland preferred flat graves, graves dug into the ground without great mounded monuments above them. That choice may not sound dramatic at first, but it reveals a major shift. It suggests that, from a very early stage, burial customs in Ireland were being reshaped by the Christian environment around them. This influence appears even more strongly in the places chosen for burial. In Ireland, Scandinavian graves show a noticeable tendency to cluster near Christian churches and within landscapes already marked by Christian ritual. Some furnished graves were found close to churches on Rathlin Island, at St John's Point, and in parts of Dublin itself. Kilmainham, one of the most important Viking burial grounds in Ireland, stood on the site of an older monastery founded centuries earlier. Research also suggests that burials at Island Bridge and Aylesbury Road may have been placed within or very near existing Christian cemetery grounds. This is an extraordinary detail because it tells us that the Scandinavian settlers were not burying their dead in isolation from the Irish world. They were choosing spaces already shaped by Christian memory and sacred tradition, even if their own rites still preserved elements of pagan custom. The landscape in which those rites were carried out was already deeply Christian. That does not mean every Viking burial in Ireland followed this pattern. A number of graves were placed in places with no obvious earlier burial use. Some appear in open ground or in areas not directly associated with churches at all. But even with these exceptions, the larger trend is still clear. The pagan customs brought by Scandinavian settlers survived in Ireland for only a relatively short period of time. There were probably very few such burials before the 840s, and the grave goods from Irish contexts do not continue much beyond the middle of the 10th century. In fact, many of the best-known finds may belong more naturally to the 9th century than the 10th. What that means is striking. The whole visible span of pagan-style Viking burial in Ireland may have lasted little more than 50 to 100 years. In historical terms, that is a brief moment. It suggests that the surrounding Christian world began shaping Scandinavian life and death almost as soon as settlement began. And this is what makes the Viking graves of Ireland so valuable. Their period of use may have been short, but they open a rare window into the early Hiberno-Scandinavian world. Graves are unlike almost any other archaeological evidence. A house can be rebuilt, a workshop reused, a street altered beyond recognition. But a grave is an intentional act. It represents a moment when the living selected objects chose a location and buried one of their own with care. Even if we can never fully recover the meaning behind every gesture, the graves still reveal what mattered to the people who made them. They show what kinds of weapons, ornaments, tools, or symbols were thought appropriate for the dead. They reveal patterns of status, gender, identity, and belief. In a period where the archaeological evidence for early Scandinavian settlement in Ireland is still patchy, these graves become even more important. For a long time, they provided some of the only direct evidence for a 9th century Scandinavian population in Ireland at all. Before modern excavations in Dublin uncovered more settlement evidence, archaeologists had almost nothing from the 9th century except the burials. Even now, most of the habitation evidence from Dublin belongs to the 10th century or later, and rural Hiberno-Norse settlement remains extremely hard to trace. That means the graves do more than tell us how people were buried. They help us map where people lived. If Viking burials were usually placed near settlements, then the clusters of graves around Dublin and at certain coastal points may point toward the actual spread of Scandinavian communities in 9th and early 10th century Ireland. The evidence is difficult and sometimes frustrating, but it is still one of the best guides we have to the earliest shape of Viking settlement on the island. The same pattern of cultural blending can also be seen in the wider story of Christianity in Ireland itself. Long before the Viking Age, Christianity had already taken root through a mixture of formal missions and quieter, less documented contacts across the Irish Sea and the Channel. The existence of Christian communities in Ireland by the early 5th century cannot be explained without assuming regular contact with both Britain and Gaul. By 431, there were already Irish believers important enough for a bishop to be sent to them from Rome. That moment is crucial because it tells us that Christianity in Ireland did not suddenly begin with one dramatic event. It had already started to spread before the most famous names entered the story. Two figures stand at the centre of that early phase: Palladius and Patrick. They came from different backgrounds, one likely from Gaul and the other from Britain, but both were educated bishops shaped by the Roman Christian world. Their presence shows clearly that Ireland was connected to the cultural and religious life of Western Europe. Patrick, especially, would go on to dominate memory and tradition, eventually overshadowing Palladius almost completely. Yet both belong to a world where ideas, texts, people, and religious practices were crossing the sea into Ireland. Even if later legends simplified that story, the reality was more complex. The Irish Church did not emerge in isolation. It was born out of exchange, travel, and adaptation. The earliest missionaries must have brought with them the essential tools of Christian worship. They would have needed books, vessels for the liturgy, and the knowledge of reading and writing that underpinned Christian teaching. Patrick himself left written works behind, and later tradition remembered him not only preaching but writing letters and instructing converts in literacy. That suggests that gospel books, psalters, and perhaps complete biblical texts were already entering Ireland in the 5th century. Writing had appeared earlier in a limited and local form, but Christianity transformed its role entirely. It brought the written word into the centre of religious authority and learning. Much of this first phase remains archaeologically elusive. The period between the later 5th century and the end of the 6th century is still hard to grasp in material terms, even though it was one of the most important phases in Irish history. These were the years when a native Christian clergy began to take shape, when Latin learning and formal education were established, when churches began to appear physically in the landscape, and when metalwork was adapted to serve religious needs. It was also during this time that Irish began to absorb many Latin words related to church life, buildings, ranks, rituals, and institutions. That linguistic change alone tells us how profound the transformation was. Yet conversion was not instant. Christianity spread gradually, and literacy remained the possession of a minority. Oral tradition remained powerful and continued to shape Irish culture alongside the new religion. By around 600, we begin to see clearer surviving evidence of this Christian world. One of the earliest Irish manuscripts still in existence dates from this time, and several remarkable reliquaries from the same period show how deeply metalworking had already been drawn into the service of the church. These small shrines, portable and precious, echo both inherited classical influence and the emergence of a distinct insular artistic style. They are not crude first experiments. They are the products of generations of growth. In them we can still hear a faint echo of the earliest missionary age, now transformed into a confident and local Christian culture. The 6th century also saw the rise of some of the most important figures in Irish religious history, especially Columba and Columbanus. Both were monks, both were deeply shaped by the monastic ideal, and both played major roles far beyond their places of origin. Columba's story is especially important for understanding how Irish Christianity developed. Later, memory often cast him in grand spiritual terms as both exile and holy wanderer, but his life can also be read in a more practical and revealing way. He moved from Ireland to Iona, not into a strange and alien world, but into a closely connected Gaelic-speaking zone on the edge of Scotland. The move still mattered enormously. It placed him at a cultural frontier, a point where Irish, British, Pictish, and later Anglo-Saxon worlds could meet. From that frontier, Iona became one of the great centres of the Christian North. It stood not at the edge of the world, but at the centre of a network stretching across Ireland and Britain. Churches and communities linked to Columba spread outward, and over time, this network became one of the most powerful ecclesiastical structures in the Irish Sea Zone. The importance of Iona later shifted to places like Kells and then Derry, but the memory and authority of the Columban tradition remained enormous. This matters for the Vikings story too, because when Scandinavian raiders and settlers entered Irish and Scottish waters, they were entering a landscape already marked by old Christian roots, monastic federations, sacred sites, and long-established ecclesiastical power. That helps explain why the interaction between Vikings and Christianity in Ireland developed as it did. The settlers were not confronting a weak or scattered religion. They were moving into a world where churches controlled land, wealth, learning, memory, and sacred prestige. Even the earliest Scandinavian burials in Ireland show signs of negotiating with that world. Flat graves instead of mounds, burials near churches, the quick fading of furnished, pagan graves, and the growing acceptance of Christian burial customs all suggest that Scandinavian communities adapted more quickly than we sometimes assume. Their old traditions did not vanish overnight, but they were being reshaped from the beginning. So when we look at the graves of Viking Ireland, we are not just seeing imported Scandinavian customs, planted unchanged in a new land. We are seeing those customs in the middle of transformation. The dead were still buried with swords, brooches, tools, and ornaments, but the places chosen for burial and the shortening life of the tradition reveal an environment that was already changing them. These graves belong to a moment when two worlds met, one shaped by older Scandinavian ritual, the other by a long-established Irish Christianity that had already built its own networks of saints, churches, books, relics, and sacred authority. The memory of Columba did not survive only in stories. It was built into some of the greatest artistic achievements of the early medieval world. His cult was given shape in writing, in metalwork, in sculpture, and in sacred objects that people touched, carried, guarded, and even carried into battle. Through these objects, Columba was not simply remembered as a saint of the past. He remained present, active, and powerful in the imagination of Ireland and Scotland for centuries. One of the clearest expressions of that memory was the Book of Duro, a gospel manuscript from the 7th century that later generations believed had been written by Columba himself. Whether or not that was true mattered less than the fact that people believed it. The book had become a relic, a physical extension of the saint. Its pages reveal a world of wide cultural reach. Its art draws from several traditions at once. Animal forms that echo Anglo-Saxon design, interlace patterns rooted in the classical world, and spiral ornament descending from older native styles. Yet these strands still sit somewhat apart, as if several worlds had been brought together without fully merging. The Book of Kells, created around the year 800, represents something more complete and more astonishing. It too was associated with Columba, and like the Book of Duro, it was treasured as part of his legacy. But here the artistic vision is fuller, richer, and more confident. The different traditions that were only loosely joined before are now fused into something entirely new. The result is one of the greatest monuments of the Columban intellectual world. It hardly matters whether it was made in Ireland or in Scotland. The book belongs to the larger cultural universe shaped by Columba's foundations, his monastic heirs, and the world that grew around them. The Book of Kells is famous not just for its beauty, but for the ambition of its images. It contains full-page scenes that stand among the earliest and most important in Western manuscript art. One of them shows the Virgin and Child, the oldest surviving example of such a scene in Western manuscript tradition. Others present moments from the life of Christ with extraordinary symbolic depth. These are not merely illustrations, they are theological images carefully constructed to speak to a learned audience while also inspiring awe. The manuscript was designed to overwhelm the eye and elevate the mind. It was not an ordinary book for ordinary use. It was a sacred object, a display of devotion, status, and artistic mastery. The importance of such books can also be seen in the way they were treated. They were not simply read. They were revered, protected, and eventually enclosed in special shrines. The Book of Duro was enclosed by a powerful king. The Book of Kells was also given a shrine, though we do not know exactly by whom. These covers are lost now, but the reverence they inspired is recorded in history. When the Book of Kells was stolen in the early 11th century, it was the shrine, not only the manuscript, that attracted the thieves. The book was later recovered, but its precious cover had been stripped away. That tells us a great deal. These manuscripts were not only spiritual treasures, they were also physical symbols of wealth, prestige, and sacred authority. The cult of Columba also found expression in portable shrines. One striking example is a small tomb-shaped reliquary from Scotland, known in later tradition as the Speckled One. It dates to the 8th century and stands in a line of development that reaches back to earlier insular shrine forms. But by this stage, the art has become more elaborate. Enamelling, animal ornament, and highly refined decoration transform the little object into something dazzling. It may be called Scottish or Pictish by modern scholars, but in truth it belongs to the shared visual language of the Irish sea world. Such shrines carried meaning far beyond their size. They contained relics, and in doing so, they made the saint physically present. That is why some of these objects became battle standards. The shrine associated with Columba was believed to possess real spiritual force. It could be carried before armies as a sign of divine favour and protection. In Ireland, another sacred object linked to a saint could serve a similar role in local dynastic wars. This tells us how closely religion, politics, and warfare were intertwined. A saint's relic was not only an object of private devotion, it was also a source of public authority and collective confidence. To carry such a shrine into battle was to place the conflict itself under sacred sanction. Sculpture added yet another layer to this world. Stone crosses and carved monuments were not merely decorative. They glorified God, honoured patrons, and preserved the memory of saints. Iona became one of the great experimental centres of sculpture in the 8th century, and it may even have been among the first places where the ringed high cross emerged in its mature form. Later, at Kells, a great cross explicitly joined the names of Patrick and Columba in one dedication. That pairing was not accidental. It reflects the relationship between two of the greatest saintly cults in early medieval Ireland. Whether it expressed harmony between them or the dominance of one over the other, it reveals how carefully church politics and sacred memory were being shaped in stone. All of this raises an obvious question. What were these great books, shrines, bells, croziers, and reliquaries actually doing in daily life? They were not ordinary objects. They were too precious, too sacred, and too closely tied to the identity of major churches. This suggests the existence of treasuries, strong rooms, guarded spaces where only certain people were allowed entry. Some hints survive of officials whose responsibility was to care for these treasures. There are also signs that pilgrims may have been admitted to see them, perhaps in exchange for offerings or dues. These sacred objects were part of a spiritual economy. They inspired devotion, but they also generated prestige, attracted visitors, and strengthened the authority of the churches that possessed them. Some of the objects associated with saints may have been placed near tombs as relics or as sacred accessories that reinforced the presence of the holy dead. Bells and croziers in particular could serve this purpose. Not all of them were practical tools still in use. Some may have been made specifically as commemorative or ritual objects. Even towers, so striking in the Irish landscape, may at times have served as places of storage for church valuables, though that was probably not their main purpose. Their true role remains difficult to define with certainty, but they clearly embodied both practical and symbolic power. They spoke of status, sanctity, and the upward reach of the Christian soul. Then the Vikings came. Their arrival is first marked in the written record at the end of the 8th century, when raids were reported on northern islands and coastal sites. From the beginning, churches were among their favourite targets. That was no accident. Churches were rich. They held metalwork, books, relics, and storehouses of food and treasure. They also gathered people, which made them a source of captives for the slave trade. For the churchmen who recorded these attacks, the Vikings were outsiders, in the strongest possible sense. They called them foreigners and pagans, people outside the people of God. The emotional force of these annal entries reflects genuine horror at what was happening. One of the most traumatic episodes was the attack on Iona in the early 9th century, when much of the community was slaughtered. In another assault, a monk named Blathmac was remembered as a martyr because he refused to reveal where the shrine of Columba had been hidden. That detail is deeply revealing. The raiders were not just attacking buildings, they were searching for portable wealth, especially the great shrines and reliquaries that had become central to church prestige and memory. The shrine of Columba was worth killing for, because it contained both spiritual meaning and immense material value. A fascinating glimpse into this world appears in a hoard found in the river Blackwater. It seems to have belonged to a metalworker, perhaps someone involved in breaking down, reworking, and redistributing precious metal. Among the contents were cut-up fragments of shrines and book covers, reduced to tiny pieces for reuse. Gilding had been carefully stripped from one piece, showing how valuable even a thin layer of gold was. Some fragments seem unfinished, as if they were in the middle of being transformed into something new. This was not simply loot hidden away, it was evidence of a working system of recycling and refashioning sacred metalwork. What makes the hoard even more important is that some of its pieces closely resemble objects found in Viking contexts in Norway. That tells us that Irish ecclesiastical metalwork was highly prized in the Scandinavian world. It was not wanted only for the bullion value of the metal. Its craftsmanship, style, and exotic prestige made it especially desirable. The Blackwater assemblage captures a moment in which sacred Irish art was being broken down and re-entering circulation through a Viking world hungry for silver, ornament, and finely made, exotic objects. Yet it would be too simple to present the Vikings as the only destroyers in this story. Irish kings and their followers were perfectly capable of attacking monasteries when it suited political goals. Monastic communities themselves could be deeply entangled in warfare, and some major churches maintained armed followings or tenant militias. Even before the Viking Age, monasteries had already been drawn into violent conflicts between rival rulers. So the Vikings entered a world where sacred sites were already part of political struggle. What made their impact so shocking was not that they introduced violence into a peaceful land, but that they expanded and redirected that violence on a new scale and for new purposes. Over time, however, conflict gave way to acculturation. Settlement, intermarriage, trade, and daily contact slowly changed the relationship between Scandinavians and the Irish Church. The descendants of raiders became part of local society. They converted to Christianity, adopted local customs, and were drawn into the same religious and political world that their ancestors had once attacked. The career of Umlaib Gwaran is one of the clearest examples. A king of Viking Dublin, he ended his life on pilgrimage to Iona. the very holy place that earlier Scandinavian raiders had devastated. There is a powerful symbolism in that journey. It shows how far the process of assimilation had gone. Coexistence also appears in the continued vitality of churches within and near the Viking towns. Dublin is the clearest example. There, in the 11th century, Christ Church was founded jointly by the King of Dublin and an Irish bishop. That partnership says a great deal. It shows that the Scandinavian elite of the city was no longer outside the Christian world. It was actively participating in shaping that world. The old boundaries between foreign raider and native Christian had blurred dramatically. By definition, Irish Christianity had always looked toward Rome, and the authority of Rome was never fundamentally rejected. Pilgrims travelled there. Relics and sacred materials were brought back. Earlier controversies over church practice were eventually resolved. But in the 8th and 9th centuries, a new current of reform appeared inside Ireland itself. Communities associated with strict religious discipline promoted more intense monastic ideals and generated an important body of devotional and liturgical texts. Later, in the 11th and 12th centuries, another reform movement emerged, this time more directly tied to the wider European Church. By then, Irish church leaders and powerful kings were increasingly concerned with organisation, discipline, and reform. New diocesan structures were created. Synods defined hierarchies more clearly. Foreign influence, especially from Canterbury and the continent, became stronger. Great kings patronised reform as a means of strengthening both religion and royal prestige. One striking example was the gifting of a major royal site to the church in a grand act of piety and power. Leading churchmen also promoted new forms of monastic life, inspired by continental models. These reforms were not only spiritual, they were visible in architecture. A new Romanesque style emerged in Ireland, combining local traditions with wider European forms. Kings often sponsored these buildings, and some of the finest examples still stand as proof of the energy of that age. But there is a deeper irony here as well. As reform and European influence strengthened, the old native artistic tradition that had produced works like the Book of Kells and the early shrine tradition began to decline. Imported objects and foreign models gradually replaced local ones. One can already see that shift in the appearance of later church treasures. So the story of Columba and the world around him stretches from illuminated manuscripts to battle shrines, from monastic networks to Viking raids, from relics and treasuries to reforming bishops and Romanesque chapels. It is not a narrow church history. It is the story of how religion, art, kingship, memory, and cultural survival were woven together in early medieval Ireland and Scotland. Columba's cult endured because it could be expressed in so many forms: books, crosses, shrines, poetry, processions, battle standards, and sacred politics. And even when the Viking Age brought violence and upheaval, that world did not disappear. It adapted, absorbed, and transformed the newcomers, just as it had transformed older influences before them. Although Ireland and Scandinavia were separated by a vast stretch of sea, with Britain lying between them, the two regions shared some striking similarities at the opening of the Viking Age. Both stood apart from the Roman world. Neither inherited the roads, cities, monumental buildings, and administrative systems that shaped life in former Roman provinces such as Britain or Gaul. That mattered deeply for art and craftsmanship. In both places, knowledge of the visual language of late antiquity came mostly through imported objects, whether obtained by trade, exchange, gift-giving, or plunder. Yet there were equally important differences. Ireland was a Celtic-speaking Christian land by the late 8th century, while Scandinavia remained rooted in a Germanic-speaking pagan world. So when Viking raiders first appeared off the Irish coast in 795, they did not encounter a blank cultural landscape. They found a country whose churches, monasteries, and artistic traditions had already been developing for centuries. There is no firm proof of direct contact between Ireland and Scandinavia before those first recorded raids. Yet the visual parallels between the two worlds are remarkable. At the end of the 8th century, animal ornament dominated metalwork in both regions. This was not because Ireland and Scandinavia had been closely connected in some forgotten age, but because both had drawn on a wider inheritance that ultimately reached back to the art of the late Roman world. In Ireland, many of these influences had passed through Anglo-Saxon Britain. That point is crucial because throughout the Viking Age, Britain often acted as the bridge through which artistic ideas moved back and forth between Ireland and Scandinavia. Direct influence certainly existed, but much of it was filtered, reshaped, and transmitted through the Irish Sea Zone and the Anglo-Saxon world. The first real archaeological traces of Scandinavian presence in Ireland belong to the period when the Vikings began establishing Longford, fortified ship camps in the early 9th century. These bases marked a decisive change. Before that, Viking activity in Ireland had mostly been fast and seasonal, consisting of sudden raids and quick departures. But by the 840s, the Scandinavians began planting themselves more firmly in the landscape. One of the earliest of these camps was established at Linn Duachale on the east coast, with another at Dublin. These bases were not only military footholds, they were the beginnings of a longer relationship between Scandinavians and Ireland, one that would leave visible traces in settlement, burial, trade, and art. At sites associated with these early bases, fragments of decorated metalwork have been found that may once have formed parts of ecclesiastical objects, looted from nearby churches. Some of these broken pieces were probably being prepared for refashioning into brooches or other ornaments favoured by the Viking settlers. This leads directly into one of the most vivid aspects of cultural exchange in the Viking Age: the movement of insular metalwork into Scandinavian hands. Across Scandinavia, hundreds of pagan Viking graves have produced decorated objects looted or acquired from Ireland and Britain. This material forms one of the clearest archaeological reflections of the Viking raids in the West. Many of the earliest of these finds date to around 800, almost immediately after the first recorded attacks. Their distribution suggests that some of the earliest raiders who came to Ireland may have come from Western Norway. The objects themselves are often fragments of church metalwork or other richly decorated fittings that had been stripped from their original settings and turned into dress ornaments. In many cases, they were fitted with pins and worn as brooches, especially by women. These reused pieces of insular metalwork were especially attractive to Viking taste. Their gilded surfaces, interlaced decoration, and cast animal ornament must have looked both luxurious and familiar. In fact, some of them would have resembled Scandinavian ornamental traditions closely enough that, at a glance, they could fit naturally into a Viking wardrobe. But even though these imports were highly valued and widely used, they did not fundamentally reshape Scandinavian art. They were admired, reused, and worn, yet they were not systematically copied in Scandinavian workshops during the early period. That is a revealing detail. It suggests that many of these insular objects entered Scandinavia not through formal craft networks or trading systems, but as plunder carried home by raiders, then converted for immediate personal use. Alongside broken fittings, complete insular dress fasteners also reached Scandinavia. Ringed pins and penannular brooches are known from Viking graves, and these were sometimes copied in large numbers. One especially important example is the Irish silver thistle brooch, which inspired many Scandinavian imitations in the 10th century. These Norse copies were usually smaller and simpler, often made in tinned bronze rather than silver, but the form clearly appealed to Scandinavian users. This pattern is significant because it suggests that Scandinavian men, especially in Norway, may have adopted certain insular elements of dress. So the influence was not limited to the looting of church treasures. It extended into the way people chose to present themselves, dressing their bodies with forms first developed across the sea. And the movement in the other direction was much more limited. In Ireland, imported Scandinavian ornaments from the 9th and early 10th centuries are relatively few. They appear mainly in Viking graves, especially oval brooches and swords with elaborate hilts, and these objects do not seem to have had much direct influence on Irish craftsmen. Earlier scholars once thought that Scandinavian oval brooches had inspired certain Irish brooch types, but this now seems unlikely. In most cases, Scandinavian objects in Ireland remained within Scandinavian communities. They do not appear to have entered Irish hands on any large scale, and they left little direct mark on native Irish metalworking. There was, however, one notable area where Scandinavian taste shaped production within Ireland itself. Between about 850 and 950, a distinct group of silver arm rings was produced in a Hiberno-Viking environment, probably centred on Dublin. These rings drew on Danish and Norwegian models and are easy to distinguish from native Irish ornament by their forms and stamped geometric designs. Yet, even here, the impact on Irish artistic tradition remained limited. These objects were probably valued above all as bullion, as portable stores of silver, rather than as ornaments that would transform local style. One rare exception survives in a brooch from a Viking grave on Rathlin Island. Its basic form belongs to the Irish tradition, but details of its decoration show the influence of contemporary Scandinavian jewellery. It stands as a rare and telling sign of real blending at the level of design. The scarcity of early Scandinavian decorative influence in Ireland is also partly due to the nature of the surviving evidence. For the period before the second quarter of the 10th century, we have very little excavated settlement material in Ireland that preserves decorated artefacts of Scandinavian type. One extraordinary exception is a ship's prow carved in the style known from great Viking ships, later reused in an early Dublin house. This unique survival hints at something much larger. There must once have been many wooden objects in Ireland, decorated in Scandinavian styles, but most were made of perishable materials and have not survived. The absence of evidence, in other words, should not be mistaken for the absence of influence. By the 10th century, clearer signs of Scandinavian artistic influence begin to appear in Ireland, though they are still restricted. A number of decorated wooden objects found in Dublin belong to a style sometimes called West Viking, a term that reflects the broader Irish sea world, of which Dublin formed a central part. This style is especially interesting because it is not simply Scandinavian. Its crowded interlace has deep insular roots, while certain ring chain and knot motifs ultimately derive from Viking art, especially the boar style. In other words, the style is already hybrid. It reflects the political and economic world linked by the Dublin-York axis, where craftsmen, merchants and rulers moved between Ireland and northern England. Even where Scandinavian influence is visible, it has already been filtered through an insular framework. What is striking, though, is how little Scandinavian mythology or overtly pagan imagery enters Irish art at this stage. This sets Ireland apart from places like the Isle of Man, Cumbria, and parts of northern Britain, where Christian sculpture could incorporate motifs from Norse legend or adopt more obvious Scandinavian visual elements. In Ireland, sculpture remains stubbornly resistant to this kind of change. The Hiberno-Norse towns, such as Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, and Limerick, produced almost no stone sculpture in the Viking period. That may partly reflect the fact that these urban sites had little pre-Viking tradition of sculpture to build upon. Unlike York or Cumbria, where earlier traditions could be adapted, the Viking towns of Ireland did not become major sculptural centres. Even those grave covers associated with Hiberno-Scandinavian communities in the Dublin region show no meaningful Scandinavian motifs. This is one of the clearest signs that cultural integration in Ireland took a very different artistic path from that seen in neighbouring parts of the Irish Sea world. There are, however, a few remarkable exceptions. One is the so-called Hogback tomb at Castle Dermot, the only known Irish example of a monument type strongly associated with Anglo-Scandinavian sculpture. Its shape and decoration are much simpler than most British examples, yet it clearly belongs to that family of monuments. Another important case is a cross shaft at Killaloe, carved by a craftsman named Thorgrim, whose name appears both in Ogham and in runes. That double inscription alone says a great deal. It reflects a bilingual and bicultural world in which Scandinavian and Irish identities could overlap within a single object. The carving itself also points toward influences from northern England. These pieces remain rare, but they prove that Scandinavian artistic ideas could enter Ireland through Christian and sculptural channels, especially in regions linked to Hiberno-Norse towns. The real breakthrough, however, comes only in the 11th century. It is then that Scandinavian art styles begin to make a visible and lasting impact on Irish art. Dublin plays the central role in this transformation. Excavations there have yielded many decorated motif pieces made of bone and stone. These were practice pieces or design layouts used by craftsmen, and they preserve the visual experiments of workshops that were blending different traditions. Many of these pieces carry interlacing and geometric ornament, familiar from Irish art, but some also display patterns closely connected to late Viking styles. One especially fine bone piece shows a design derived from the ringerike and Urness traditions of Scandinavia. Its pattern closely parallels the decoration of an Irish shrine known to have been made in the later 11th century by a named craftsman whose name itself suggests mixed Irish and Norse ancestry. That detail is important. It reminds us that these artistic fusions were not abstract processes. They were carried out by real people whose own identities may already have bridged the two worlds. The strongest Scandinavian influences in late 11th and early 12th century Ireland appear especially in ecclesiastical art. This is a crucial point. The styles were not entering Irish culture mainly through pagan imagery or secular display. They were being absorbed into the art of shrines, reliquaries, croziers, manuscripts, and church ornament. That suggests a route of transmission tied to the church, and especially to the Hiberno-Norse towns, which maintained links with England and with centres such as Canterbury. By this period, Scandinavian-derived motifs had become part of a wider reforming and international Christian culture, rather than markers of a distinct Viking pagan identity. Even then, however, the Scandinavian styles were rarely copied directly. Irish craftsmen reshaped them. In Scandinavian art, the ringerike and Urness styles often favour freer asymmetry, flowing animals, and a looser sense of movement. In Ireland, these motifs are disciplined, balanced, and reorganised. The animals become more controlled, the layouts more symmetrical, the curves more measured. The result is not Scandinavian art transplanted into Ireland. It is Scandinavian material reworked in an Irish visual language. That transformation can be seen especially well in woodcarving from Dublin, where one finds a distinctive local school characterised by elegant animal heads, tightly arranged interlace, and ornament that draws from Viking styles, without ever abandoning insular order and rhythm. The Urness style in particular became especially important in 12th century Ireland. It appears in metalwork, sculpture, and manuscript illumination, and often in some of the finest ecclesiastical works of the period. Yet again, its Irish form is distinctive. Instead of the dramatic and often asymmetrical interplay of a large beast with thinner serpents that one sees in Scandinavia, Irish versions tend to organise these motifs around carefully structured crossings and figure-of-8 patterns. The animals take on a more abstract and even width. The overall effect is refined, disciplined, and unmistakably local. This style became so successful that it continued well into the Romanesque period, outliving the Viking Age itself. Although ecclesiastical art provides the richest examples, these late Viking styles also appear in secular objects. Decorated sword fittings, drinking horn terminals, and other objects show that the visual language circulating through Dublin workshops was not confined to churches. Evidence from unfinished castings and motif pieces shows that local craftsmen were manufacturing decorated fittings in these styles during the 11th and 12th centuries. This matters because it shows that late Viking artistic influence in Ireland was not just imported taste. It was being actively made and remade in Irish towns. Dublin, of course, dominates the story because its excavations have produced the greatest body of evidence. But it would be wrong to imagine that all this artistic activity was confined to the city. Other Hiberno-Norse towns, such as Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and the region around Limerick, have also produced motif pieces and decorated objects that show similar mixtures of Irish and Scandinavian elements. Some of these pieces have links with southern England as well, reminding us once again that the transmission of styles was rarely direct and simple. The Irish sea world was a network, and artistic ideas moved along its routes in multiple directions at once. When all this evidence is brought together, a clear pattern emerges. In the early Viking Age, there was some mutual borrowing of forms between Ireland and Scandinavia, but it was limited. In the 10th century, Scandinavian influence on Irish art remained selective and relatively weak, far less extensive than in places like Man or Cumbria. This probably reflects the early Christianization of Scandinavian settlers in Ireland and their concentration in urban centres, rather than broad rural settlement. Only from the early 11th century onward do Scandinavian artistic elements begin to make a sustained impression. And even then, they are rarely accepted in pure form. Irish artists took what they wanted, reshaped it, disciplined it, and made it serve local taste and local religious culture. That, in many ways, is the heart of the story. The artistic relationship between Ireland and Scandinavia was never one of simple domination or imitation. It was a long process of selection, adaptation, and reinterpretation. Viking raiders first carried Irish metalwork home as loot, turning fragments of church treasure into dress ornaments. Later, Scandinavian settlers in Ireland brought their own taste, their own jewellery, and eventually their own artistic motifs into the island's workshops. But in Ireland, these elements were not simply copied. They were absorbed into a much older and already powerful artistic tradition. By the time Scandinavian influence truly flowered in Irish art, it no longer looked wholly Scandinavian. It had become part of something new, a Hiberno-Norse visual language shaped by trade, urban life, intermarriage, Christianity, and the creative discipline of Irish craftsmen. When the Vikings first arrived in Ireland, they entered a land that had already been Christian for more than 3.5 centuries. It was not only a Christian land, but a deeply literate one. Across the island stood monasteries and church schools that preserved books, produced scholars, and shaped how people understood the world. These were the same places that suffered most in the earliest Viking attacks. So it is hardly surprising that some of the first reactions to the newcomers survive in the writings of churchmen. And what those writers reveal, above all else, is fear. One Irish poet, writing in the margin of a manuscript in the 9th century, looked out at a stormy sea and took comfort in its violence. The wind and waves, harsh as they were, seemed safer to him than the thought of Viking warriors crossing the water. Another cleric, perhaps writing in the Dublin region, prayed to be saved from foreigners, enemies, and pagans, as if those three words all meant the same thing. In the minds of many early Irish churchmen, the Vikings were not simply another hostile people. They were outsiders in every possible sense, foreign in language, foreign in belief, and foreign in conduct. They came from beyond the known order of Christian society, and that made them terrifying. The writings of the period repeatedly describe them not only as pagans, but as plunderers. This image appears again and again. Monks speak of them carrying off spoils, stripping wealth from churches and returning more than once to the same sacred places. In one religious text, a holy man is granted a wish that foreigners should not attack his church more than a single time. That tells us how people were beginning to think. A Viking raid was no longer an unimaginable disaster, but a recurring threat. The fear had become practical. It had entered the rhythm of expectation. Another text makes clear just how serious these attacks were felt to be, by allowing flight from Vikings as one of the few acceptable reasons for breaking Sabbath rules. In other words, preserving life in the face of pagan violence could excuse even religious transgression. That is a remarkable measure of how urgent the danger seemed. These literary reactions match what the annals tell us. In the late 8th and early 9th centuries, Viking attacks were usually quick, sharp, and aimed at wealthy church centres. The monasteries were rich, visible, and poorly suited to military defence. They held books, reliquaries, metalwork, livestock, food, and people. To the raiders, they were ideal targets. To the monks, they were holy places under assault. It is no wonder, then, that church writers tried to explain why such things were happening, and they usually explained them in moral terms. Again and again, they argued that the coming of the Vikings was a punishment. Ireland had sinned. The people had grown careless in faith, neglected holy days, or allowed moral decay to spread. Therefore, God had permitted the pagans to come. This idea proved incredibly durable. Even long after the first great wave of Viking terror had passed, religious writers continued to use the image of the Viking raider as a warning. In prophetic texts composed or recopied in later centuries, heathen invaders still hover over the horizon as instruments of divine punishment. If the Irish fall into spiritual decline, if they grow lax, if they fail in devotion, the old scourge will return. This literary habit survived well after the Vikings themselves had settled, converted, and become part of Irish society. In that sense, the Viking became more than a historical enemy. He became a symbol. He represented divine anger, social disorder, and the terrible consequences of moral failure. That symbolic use of the Vikings became even more powerful in later historical writing. By the 11th and 12th centuries, authors were using the memory of Viking violence to glorify the ancestors of powerful Irish dynasties. In such works, Viking oppressors reappear as the perfect enemy, brutal, unified, and seemingly invincible, only to be defeated by heroic Irish kings. The point of these stories was not simply to recount the past. It was to praise the descendants of those kings in the present. If a ruler's ancestor had crushed such a fearsome foe, then the ruler himself inherited some of that reflected greatness. This is especially clear in works celebrating major figures such as Brian Boru. In these narratives, the Vikings are often portrayed as a great foreign menace pressing down on all Ireland, while Brian stands as the saviour who broke their power. But the reality was far more complicated. Brian fought Vikings, yes, but he also allied with them. He married into their world, used their troops, and dealt with them as one political force among many. The famous Battle of Clontarf was not a simple war of Irish against foreigner. It was part of a tangled struggle among Irish dynasties, with Norse and Irish alliances crossing ethnic lines. Brian's own daughter married the King of Dublin. That fact alone tells us how impossible it is to draw a clean boundary between Irish and Viking in the later period. In truth, the process of integration had begun much earlier. The annals already show Irish and Norse fighting together in the 9th century. Marriages between Viking rulers and Irish royal families may have taken place by the later 9th century. By the 10th century, these ties had become even more common. Viking kings adopted Irish nicknames. They married Irish women. Their children bore Irish names. Some retired, in thoroughly Irish fashion, to monastic, holy places at the end of their lives. One king of Dublin even commissioned praise poetry from a leading Irish poet and rewarded him in proper courtly style. That moment is especially revealing. The poet treats the Viking ruler not as some alien monster, but as a patron like any other king. He may live in Dublin and bear a Norse name, but he has entered the Irish literary and political world. This blending is visible in many kinds of sources. A Welsh prophetic poem from the 10th century even imagines both the Irish and the men of Dublin coming together against the English. That only makes sense in a world where the Norse of Dublin were already seen as part of the political order of the Irish Sea, not as mere outsiders. Irish poems describing military action also treat foreigners as one among several possible enemies, no more inherently exceptional than rival Irish provinces. In legal and courtly texts, the Norse of Dublin could be listed alongside Irish peoples as owing tribute to an overking. They had become part of the structure of power, and yet the old image of the Viking as pagan destroyer never fully disappeared. It was too useful. Churchmen could still invoke it when warning their audiences against sin. Political writers could still summon it when magnifying the achievements of royal ancestors. The contradiction is only apparent. In daily life, Vikings and Irish could intermarry, make alliances, and share poets. In literature, the same Vikings could be reimagined as archetypal enemies, whenever the needs of moral instruction or dynastic propaganda required it. By the 11th and 12th centuries, another transformation had begun. Places once associated with Viking homelands, especially names like Lochlann, started to drift away from strict geography and into the realm of literary imagination. In earlier usage, Lochlann could refer to Scandinavian zones in the North Atlantic, perhaps even Viking Scotland in some contexts, or to Norway in others. But over time, it became something more fluid, more distant, almost mythic. In tales of heroes and wonder, Lochlann became a place from which monstrous warriors, strange kings, and supernatural threats might emerge. It stood not just for Scandinavia, but for the dangerous edge of the world. In some stories, heroes journey to Lochlann, much as they journey to lands of shadow or even to hell. In others, kings of Lochlann and related northern islands appear as allies, summoned into Irish conflicts, but often with little real role to play, beyond adding grandeur and exotic reach to the tale. This literary transformation is important because it shows how memory works. As the real Vikings of Ireland became neighbours, converts, rulers, and patrons, the old fear was pushed outward into a mythic geography. The threatening foreigner did not vanish. He was relocated into story. By the end of the 12th century, this process was almost complete. Lochlann and related northern lands had become quasi-otherworldly spaces in heroic literature. Their inhabitants might still be dangerous, but now they belonged to legend as much as history. Meanwhile, in the real world, the descendants of the Vikings in Ireland were no longer the newest or most urgent foreign presence. The Anglo-Normans had arrived, bringing with them a new wave of conquest, new military pressures, and a new kind of foreign power. The old Gael, the Viking foreigners, had by then become part of the local fabric. That is one of the most fascinating parts of this story. The same people who first appeared in Irish writing as savage pagans from beyond the sea were, within a few generations, woven into Irish political life, Irish marriage networks, Irish patronage systems, and Irish literature itself. They could still be used as villains in stories of the past, but in the present they were often rulers, allies, and subjects like anyone else. Their identity had changed, but so had Ireland's memory of them. So, when we look at Irish literary responses to the Vikings, we are not just watching people react to invasion. We are watching a culture try to understand catastrophe, absorb change, and reshape memory. First came terror. Storms were safer than the sea roads of Lochline. Then came explanation. The raids were punishment for sin. Then came adaptation. Alliances, marriages, poets, kings. And finally came myth. The Viking homeland drifted toward the edges of the imagination. Part geography, part otherworld. When the Vikings settled in England, they left behind a deep mark on the land itself. Across northern and eastern England, their language shaped countless place names, and many Norse words entered local speech and later, even Standard English. In Ireland, the outcome was very different. The Vikings certainly raided, settled, traded, ruled towns, and changed history, but their impact on the Irish language and on Irish place names was much smaller. At first glance, this might seem easy to explain. English and Danish were both Germanic languages, close enough that communication, however rough, must often have been possible. Irish, by contrast, belonged to a completely different language family, and to a Scandinavian ear it would have sounded utterly alien. That barrier clearly mattered. Yet it cannot be the whole answer, because in places like the Western Isles of Scotland and the Isle of Man, where Celtic languages were also spoken, Norse settlers left behind a strong mark on local place names. So if Ireland was different, the reason must lie not only in language, but in the particular kind of Viking activity that took place there. The surviving Scandinavian place names in Ireland are few, but they are revealing. Many cluster around the coast, especially on islands, in harbours, and around the chief Viking ports. This already tells us something important. The Norse presence in Ireland was strongly maritime. Their earliest world in Ireland was a world of sea routes, anchorages, islands, estuaries, and defended coastal bases. Some islands around the Irish coast still preserve Scandinavian names, and these almost certainly belong to the early age of raiding. These were the places where monasteries stood, where hermits lived, where ships could shelter, and where raiders could watch the coast or hold captives. Islands such as Lambay, Dalkey, and others in Dublin Bay fit naturally into that pattern. In some cases, the Norse name seems to have translated or reshaped an older Irish one. That is significant because it hints at direct contact between Irish speakers and Scandinavians. It suggests that the Norse were not simply imposing names in total isolation. Sometimes they were hearing local names, interpreting them, and recasting them in their own language. One of the clearest examples of this can be seen in Dalkey. Its Scandinavian form seems to reflect the meaning of an older Irish name for the island, rather than replacing it completely. That kind of half-translation points to a zone of real linguistic contact. Something similar may lie behind Ireland's Eye, where the Norse appear to have misunderstood an Irish personal name and turned it into something that made sense in their own language. These details are small, but they matter. They show that naming was not always a one-sided act of conquest. Sometimes it was a process of listening, adapting, and misunderstanding. Prominent coastal landmarks also received Scandinavian names. Howth is a good example. Its Norse name described the shape of the headland, a useful term for sailors passing the coast. This kind of naming reflects the practical vision of seafarers. A striking headland, a safe anchorage, a dangerous current, a narrow inlet, these were the things that mattered to people who lived by ships and sea routes. Even when the Irish retained their own names for such places, the Scandinavian names could survive in parallel and eventually pass into English. This reminds us that the Vikings did not need to rename all of Ireland to make their presence felt. They only had to leave their mark on the places most important to their own lives: the sea gates, river mouths, and fortified settlements of the coast. That pattern becomes even clearer when we look at the major Viking strongholds. Several of the most important coastal settlements in Ireland bear Scandinavian names, especially those ending in the Norse word for an inlet or fjord. Waterford, Wexford, Strangford, Carlingford, and others belong to this group. These names were not random. They described topographical features near which the settlements had been established. In each case, the Norse settlers seem to have focused on the physical shape and usefulness of the harbour. Some names referred to strong tidal currents. Others may have pointed to mountain shapes, used as navigation marks. One may even preserve the memory of a Scandinavian personal name, perhaps belonging to a leader associated with the settlement. The important point is this: where the Vikings had enough power and permanence, they could establish Nordic names for strategic coastal centres. Wicklow and Arklow belong to another group of Scandinavian place names, this time using a Norse word for meadow. These too are revealing. They suggest not just fleeting raids, but a settled Norse presence in places where the land itself mattered, whether for grazing, harbourside occupation, or the use of surrounding territory. Some names seem to include Norse personal names, which may point to local leaders or settlers remembered in the landscape. Even Smerwick on the Dingle Peninsula appears to be a wholly new Scandinavian naming of a bay, perhaps inspired by the fertile farmland around it. Here again, we see the Vikings reading the Irish landscape through their own needs and vocabulary. In a few places, Norse influence did not replace an Irish name, but altered the route by which that name reached later English. Limerick is a good case. Its modern English form seems not to have come directly from Irish, but through a Scandinavian version of the Irish name. Dublin offers an even more famous example. The city's name is Irish in origin, but the Norse adopted the name of the dark pool where ships anchored, while the Irish preferred a different local name focused on a ford upriver. When the Anglo-Normans later learned the name of the city, they seem to have taken over the Norse choice rather than the Irish one. That is a subtle but powerful sign of Viking influence. They did not invent the name Dublin, but they helped determine which existing Irish name would pass into wider use. Within Dublin itself, there are traces of Scandinavian political vocabulary in the landscape. The name of the assembly place at College Green preserves the Norse term for a public meeting site. That suggests not only settlement, but organised civic and political life. If another place name in Wexford also records such an assembly, then we may be looking at evidence for rural Norse meeting places as well. These are not the marks of passing raiders. They are signs of a society setting up its own institutions on Irish soil. And yet, despite all this, the Norse naming footprint in Ireland remained narrow compared with what happened in England. The reason becomes clearer when we look beyond the ports themselves. In England, Scandinavian settlers took over large rural areas and gave new names to many individual settlements. In Ireland, there is very little evidence for such widespread redistribution of land under Norse names. The Vikings controlled hinterlands around their towns, especially around Dublin and Waterford, and this control is sometimes visible in local place names. But many of these names were actually created by Irish speakers, not by Scandinavians. This is one of the most revealing features of all. Around Dublin, for example, several settlements preserve Norse personal names, but the actual naming formula is Irish. The first element is the Irish word for a settlement, while the second is a Norse personal name. In other words, the Irish were naming these places after Scandinavian landholders, or families, but they were doing so in Irish. That tells us something fundamental about power and language in Viking Ireland. The Norse may have held the land, but the naming habits of the wider countryside remained Irish. A similar pattern can be seen around Waterford. In these cases, the Norse presence is real and visible, but it has been absorbed into an Irish naming system rather than replacing it. This stands in sharp contrast to the Danelaw in England. There, many settlements received names built directly from Scandinavian personal names and Scandinavian settlement terms. That reflects a much deeper rural takeover. In Ireland, by contrast, there is no convincing place name evidence for the breakup of large estates into many small Norse-named farmsteads on the English model. The Vikings in Ireland were powerful, but their strength was concentrated in towns, ports, and limited coastal territories. Their dominance did not spread far enough into the countryside to remake the naming system of the island. The same pattern appears in personal names. Irish sources begin recording Norse names fairly early, especially the names of Viking leaders. Over time, some Norse names were adopted into Irish usage and became familiar in Irish political life. Names such as Olaf, Guthfrith, Ivar, Ragnar, and Sitriok entered Irish society and remained in use for generations. This shows real integration. These were no longer names confined to foreign raiders. They had become part of the naming world of Ireland itself. There is also evidence for Norse-style nicknames being used in Ireland, and in some cases Irish names could be combined with Norse bynames. This is a fascinating sign of cultural blending. It suggests that in mixed communities, people could move between naming traditions, just as they moved between languages and loyalties. Some names may even have reached Ireland from the Danelaw rather than directly from Scandinavia. That is especially likely in the later period, when fresh waves of Scandinavian influence came not straight from Norway or Denmark, but through Viking England and the wider Irish Sea world. The coinage of Dublin offers a glimpse of this. The city's mint used moneyers whose names were sometimes Anglo-Saxon, sometimes Scandinavian, and some of these forms strongly suggest men who had come from the Danelaw. This reminds us that the Viking world of Ireland was never isolated. It was linked to York, to England, to Scotland, to the Isles, and beyond. One especially interesting Irish name connected with the Viking Age is not Norse at all in form, but Irish. The name, meaning black foreigner, became common and survives today in anglicised form as one of the most widespread surnames in the Dublin region. Originally, such terms could distinguish between different groups of Vikings, but over time they took on lives of their own as personal and family names. This again shows how deeply the memory of the Scandinavian presence entered Irish society, even when expressed through Irish language. So why did the Vikings leave so little mark on Irish place names compared with England? The answer lies in the nature of their settlement. In Ireland, the Norse established powerful coastal towns, important ports, and some hinterlands, but they did not remake the countryside on a broad scale. They did not settle the island in the same dense and widespread rural pattern seen in the Danelaw. Their strongest presence remained urban and maritime. As a result, the names they left behind are concentrated in harbours, islands, headlands, town sites, and a limited number of settlements around those centres. At the same time, the Irish language remained strong enough not merely to survive, but to absorb Scandinavian elements on its own terms. Even where Norsemen held land, Irish speakers often named the place in Irish. Even where Scandinavian names existed, they could coexist with older Irish ones. And when later English forms developed, they sometimes preserved Norse versions of Irish names, rather than purely Scandinavian creations. All of this reflects a world of contact, adaptation, and limited but real integration, not one of total linguistic replacement. By the late 12th century, the old Scandinavian world of Dublin was already fading, yet traces of it could still be heard in personal names. In surviving name rolls from the city, Norse names appear only now and then, and even those are no longer overwhelming. Some of the most common are names built around Thor, the old northern god, names that had also long been familiar in Scandinavia itself. But what is most striking is not their number, but their rarity. This was no longer a city dominated by a loud and separate Norse-speaking identity. The old Viking population was still present, but it had become only one strand in a more mixed society. A few unusual names and insulting by-names survive, showing flashes of local humour and hybrid speech, but they feel like late echoes of a culture that had once stood much more clearly apart. The place names of Ireland tell a similar story. The strongest Scandinavian mark appears around the fortified ports and their nearby rural zones, yet even there the Viking footprint is limited. Still, loanwords in Irish preserve a more intimate kind of contact. Some of the earliest borrowed terms belong to farming life, words for things like a sheaf, a fenced garden plot, and beans. Others belong to clothing and daily routine, cloak, button, breeches, and similar items of ordinary life. These are not the words of distant enemies. They are the words of people living close enough to exchange tools, garments, crops, and habits. Trade also left its mark. Terms for market and money entered Irish speech, and even the word for beer suggests the arrival of a drink different from what many Irish people had known before. There were also words tied to administration, law, servitude, and house searching. All of them point to contact at a practical level in workshops, markets, fields, ships, and courts. But the most revealing group of all belongs to the sea. Before the Viking Age, the Irish certainly knew boats, rivers, and coastal travel, but their maritime vocabulary was much less developed in some important areas. It was contact with the Norse that transformed this part of the language. Words for rudder, sheet, thwart, anchor, warship, rope, oar fittings, and steersman entered Irish from Scandinavian speech. Even names of deep-sea fish came with them. This tells us something larger than vocabulary alone. It shows that the Vikings brought not only ships, but also a whole new maritime confidence. Through them, Ireland became more deeply connected to the sea as a working world of navigation, fishing, trade, and warfare. The language remembers that shift. Long after the first longships had vanished, Irish still carried Norse words in the mouth whenever it spoke of masts, ropes, rudders, and the open water. Even so, the number of Norse loanwords in Irish remained fairly small. That suggests that intense bilingual mixing was limited. The Scandinavians in Ireland seem, for a long time, to have lived largely within their own strongholds, speaking their own language while trading and bargaining with Irish speakers when necessary. There are hints of a rough market speech, a broken shared tongue used in negotiation. Enough to do business, but hardly enough to merge two languages fully. The Norse towns may have remained linguistically distinct, almost until the Anglo-Norman age. If so, that would help explain why English later picked up some Irish town names, through Scandinavian forms, rather than directly from Irish. The Viking towns were still, in some sense, speaking Norse even near the end. Yet the Viking story in Ireland was never only an Irish story. From the end of the 8th century onward, the Scandinavian movement westward spread far beyond Ireland itself. It reached England, Scotland, the Scottish Isles, the Faroes, Iceland, Greenland, and even the edge of North America. Over time, a broad Scandinavian world took shape across the North Atlantic. A loose but real network of communities linked by ships, habits, family ties, commerce, and memory. In that world, Ireland occupied a special position. It was not the most remote colony nor the original homeland, but one of the great western centres where Scandinavian and Celtic worlds met most intensely. The settlers who spread across the northern seas brought with them more than weapons and ambition. They carried familiar ideas of house, farm, tool, and social order. Across places as distant as Shetland, the Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland, one finds versions of the classic Scandinavian longhouse. Even in treeless landscapes, settlers clung to this familiar form, adapting it with stone-lined walls where timber was scarce. The shape of the house mattered. It was more than a shelter, it was a statement of belonging, a reminder of home, a way of carrying Scandinavia across the ocean. A man could travel from one edge of the North Atlantic world to another, and still enter a house that felt recognisably his own. The same was true of many ordinary objects. Soapstone vessels, whetstones, and other tools reveal habits and preferences carried from Scandinavia into the new settlements. In some places, such as Shetland, local resources made it easy to continue these traditions. In others, like the Faroes, settlers had to import materials or finished goods from abroad. This meant that the scattered communities of the North Atlantic were never fully self-contained. They depended on exchange. They needed centres where goods could be gathered, redistributed, and transformed. That is where Ireland became crucial. Unlike the rural Norse communities of the North Atlantic, Viking Ireland developed towns. Dublin, Waterford, Cork, Wexford, and Limerick became urban centres of a kind that most Western Scandinavian colonies lacked. They were surrounded by hinterlands, but they were also workshops, ports, and gateways into wider markets. The more remote northern colonies had farms, assemblies, and legal communities, but not many true towns. Ireland gave the Western Viking world something different: urban nodes that linked rural settler societies to international trade. This role became especially important in the 10th century. The earliest Scandinavian settlement in Ireland had been unstable. Dublin itself had once been lost and had to be retaken. But once the Norse towns were securely re-established in the early 10th century, they created a durable urban base for the wider Western Viking world. From that point on, communities in Scotland, the Isles, the Faroes, Iceland, and beyond had better access to markets, luxury goods, staple imports, and prestige objects. Ireland was not simply one more Viking colony. It was one of the main engines of the Western Scandinavian economy. And with that came cultural influence. One of the clearest examples can be seen in ringed pins. These were not originally Scandinavian in form. Their roots lay in Celtic tradition, especially Irish dress culture. But in Ireland, Scandinavian settlers adopted them, transformed them, and gave them a distinctly Hiberno-Norse life. From there, they spread across the Western Viking world. In the 10th century, such pins appear from Ireland all the way to Iceland and even farther west. They are common in Viking graves and settlements across the Atlantic colonies, yet they are relatively rare in Scandinavia itself. That pattern is telling. It suggests that these objects had become badges of a specifically Western Norse identity. One shaped in Ireland and then exported outward. The same may be said of certain arm rings made from jet or similar dark materials. Evidence from Dublin shows that such ornaments were being made or worked there, and finds from Scotland, Orkney, Shetland, the Faroes, and Iceland suggest that they circulated widely through the Western colonies. Again, they are not typical products of Norway itself. Instead, they belong to the cultural world that grew up between Ireland and the North Atlantic settlements. These were objects of identity as much as adornment. They marked out a community that was no longer simply Norwegian, nor purely Irish, but something new. That may be the most important point of all. The Scandinavian communities of the North Atlantic did not remain frozen copies of their homelands. They created a new Western identity. In their farms, house forms, and use of materials, they held firmly to rural Scandinavian traditions. But in personal ornaments, artistic taste, and daily equipment, they also absorbed Celtic influences, especially those filtered through the Hiberno-Norse towns of Ireland. This was not accidental borrowing. It was the material expression of a cultural world in which Scandinavian settlers, Irish ports, Scottish islands, and Atlantic colonies had become deeply connected. So the story is not simply one of Vikings, arriving, raiding, and vanishing. It is the story of a Western Scandinavian sea world taking shape, a world where Dublin mattered as much as many places in Scandinavia, a world where a farmer in Shetland or Iceland might live in a Scandinavian-style longhouse, sharpen his tools on Norwegian stone, and fasten his clothes with a pin made in the fashion of Viking Dublin. A world where Old Norse habits met Celtic forms and produced something neither side had possessed before. When Scandinavian settlers first spread across Ireland and the North Atlantic, they did not carry only weapons, ships, and ambition. They also carried habits of speech, ways of building, tools of daily life, and a clear sense of what a proper home and a proper community should look like. Yet as these settlers moved farther west, especially into Ireland and then beyond into the Scottish Isles, the Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland, their world began to change. The result was not simply a copy of Scandinavia overseas. It became something broader and more complex, a Western sea world shaped by both Scandinavian and Celtic influence. One small but revealing clue lies in names. Even in late medieval Dublin, old Scandinavian personal names still survived, though they were no longer common. Some of them were familiar names from the Old Norse world, especially compounds built around Thor. Their survival shows continuity, but their rarity shows change. The Norse-speaking community had not vanished, yet it was no longer as culturally dominant or as separate as it had once been. By that stage, Scandinavian identity in Ireland had already been mixed, worn down, adapted, and folded into a wider urban society. Language tells the same story even more clearly. The number of Norse loanwords in Irish is not large, but the kind of words borrowed matters enormously. Some belong to farming life and suggest close contact in the countryside around Viking strongholds. Others belong to clothing and everyday domestic life. Still others come from trade, law, and administration. These are the words of people who dealt with one another often enough to exchange not just goods, but habits and practices. But the most important group of all belongs to the sea. Some of the key maritime terms in Irish came from Norse. Words for rudder, sheet, thwart, anchor, rope, steersman, and warship entered the language through contact with the Vikings. Even names of deep-sea fish came with them. That is not a minor detail. It means the Vikings helped reshape how the Irish thought and spoke about seafaring. In a very real sense, they widened Ireland's practical relationship with the sea. And yet, the Norse linguistic mark on Ireland remained surprisingly light when compared with England. That tells us something important. The Scandinavian presence in Ireland, though powerful, did not spread as deeply and broadly through the rural landscape as it did in parts of the Danelaw. The Vikings in Ireland remained above all a coastal, urban and maritime force. Their towns mattered enormously. Their fleets mattered enormously. But the Irish language and the Irish countryside remained strong enough to absorb them without being transformed on the English model. To understand what made Viking Ireland so important, we need to place it inside a much larger story. From the late 8th century onward, Scandinavian expansion stretched westward on a remarkable scale. It reached Ireland, England, Scotland, the Hebrides, Orkney, Shetland, the Faroes, Iceland, Greenland, and even the edge of North America. Over time, this created a broad Scandinavian world of the Western Seas. It was not an empire in the neat, later medieval sense, but it was a connected sphere of movement, trade, settlement, and cultural exchange. The sea that separated these communities also tied them together. It became less a barrier than a highway. Within that Western world, Ireland played a special role. The Scandinavian settlements farther north, especially in the islands and the North Atlantic, were overwhelmingly rural. They were built around farmsteads, grazing systems, local assemblies, and scattered communities. They had legal structures, regional identities, and strong traditions. But they generally lacked true towns. Ireland was different. There, the Scandinavians founded and rebuilt urban centres such as Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. These towns became commercial and political hubs. That made Ireland the urban heart of the Western Scandinavian world. The settlers who spread into the North Atlantic did not abandon their Scandinavian habits. Across widely separated lands, from Scotland to Greenland, we can recognise the same broad building tradition. The longhouse remained central. Even where timber was scarce and landscapes were almost treeless, settlers clung to the familiar shape of the Scandinavian house, adapting it with stone walls and local materials. That choice was not simply practical. In fact, in some places it was highly impractical, because wood was so limited. The longhouse endured because it meant something. It was part of how these people defined home, authority, safety, and social life. It was a cultural marker, a familiar structure that allowed emigrants to feel they still belonged to the same world, even when they had crossed vast stretches of ocean. The same continuity appears in other parts of material culture. Certain tools, raw materials, and household objects travelled with Scandinavian settlers from the homelands into the Western colonies. Soapstone vessels, whetstones, and other everyday items reveal strong continuity of habit and taste. But conditions differed sharply from place to place. In Shetland, good stone resources made it easier to maintain parts of the old toolkit. In the Faroes, where such materials were lacking, finished objects or raw materials had to be imported. This meant the Western Scandinavian communities could never be fully self-contained. Even if they were farming societies on remote islands, they depended on wider networks of exchange. That is where Ireland's towns became vital. Once the Scandinavian urban centres in Ireland had become firmly established in the early 10th century, they offered the rural communities of the North Atlantic something they themselves did not possess: access to markets, workshops, imported goods, bullion, skilled craftspeople, and long-distance trade. Dublin in particular became more than a local town. It became one of the great supply and exchange centres of the Western Viking world. Through it, and through other Irish ports, the northern colonies could obtain both practical necessities and prestige goods. And this urban role shaped culture as well as economy. Some forms of personal equipment that spread widely through the North Atlantic seem to have moved outward from the Scandinavian settlements in Ireland. This may have been a matter of ideas, fashion, and imitation, but it may also reflect the movement of people themselves. The Western Sea world was full of travellers, craftsmen, merchants, warriors, fostered children, wives, slaves, and migrants of mixed background. Cultural transfer was not abstract. it happened through human movement. One of the clearest examples is the ringed pin. This object was not originally Scandinavian. Its roots were Irish and Celtic. Yet Scandinavian settlers in Ireland adopted it quickly, reshaped it in their own way, and turned it into one of the most characteristic items of dress across the Western Viking world. By the 10th century, ringed pins of Hiberno-Norse style were appearing from Ireland to Iceland and even farther west. Their distribution shows that they belonged, above all, to the emigrant world of the Atlantic colonies. They were not simply Irish objects anymore, and they were not purely Scandinavian either. They had become Western Norse objects, products of a hybrid identity that first took shape in the Irish Sea Zone. Arm rings made from jet or lignite tell a similar story. Evidence from Dublin shows that these objects were being worked there, and they also appear across the settlements of Scotland, the Northern Isles, the Faroes, and Iceland. Again, this was not a pattern centred on Norway itself. These ornaments belong to a Western sphere, one in which Irish and Scandinavian influences had already fused. Such objects were not just decorative. They helped express who people were. They told the wearer, and everyone who saw the wearer, that this was someone formed in the Western Viking world, not simply in the old Scandinavian homeland. Technology may tell a similar story. For a long time, horizontal mills in the islands of the West were often treated as if they were purely Norse imports. But the details of the millstones complicate that view. Certain structural features found on querns and millstones in the Western colonies seem not to have come from Scandinavia at all. Instead, they have closer links with technology already known in the British Isles and Ireland before the Viking Age, perhaps ultimately inherited through Roman influence. If that is correct, then the horizontal mill in the West may not have been something Scandinavians simply brought with them unchanged. It may have been something they adopted, adapted, and then carried onward through their own settlement world. In other words, just like the ringed pin, it may have become part of Scandinavian life only after close contact with Celtic and British societies. The same may be true of the shieling system in some North Atlantic regions. In places such as the Faroes, seasonal upland farming sites appear linked to place names that contain a Gaelic-derived term for shieling. This is a powerful clue. It suggests that some aspects of pastoral organisation in the North Atlantic were influenced not directly from Norway, but from the Hiberno-Scandinavian and Irish Sea world. Such a feature would make perfect sense in a mixed cultural zone where Scandinavian settlers were learning from neighbouring Celtic-speaking communities, and then carrying adapted practices into new settlements farther north and west. There may even be similar questions to ask about baking stones. These have often been regarded as an original Norwegian development, but finds in Shetland suggest a more complicated picture. It is possible that these too belong to a pattern of exchange in which settlers in the Western colonies encountered local practices, adapted them, and later transmitted them back eastward. If so, then influence did not run in one direction only. The Western colonies were not passive recipients of Scandinavian culture. They became active zones of innovation and transformation in their own right. This possibility becomes even more intriguing when we think about population movement in the late 9th century. At the same time that political consolidation was reshaping Norway, there was also instability in the Hiberno-Scandinavian world of the Western Isles. Groups of mixed Scandinavian and Gaelic character, often associated with the Irish Sea region, seem to have been on the move. If emigrants from Norway merged with Hiberno-Scandinavian groups, already drifting north and west, then the resulting communities in places like the Faroes and Iceland would have inherited a blended identity from the very start. That would help explain why the earliest settlers in those regions are sometimes associated in tradition with Christian or Celtic names, and why material culture in the Atlantic colonies so often combines Scandinavian structures with Western, especially Irish Sea, influences. For a time, this Western Scandinavian world flourished. It stretched from the old homelands to the urban ports of Ireland, and on into the island colonies of the North Atlantic. But it did not last forever. After around 1100, a new phase began. Christian institutions grew stronger. The Western colonies were drawn more tightly into the orbit of the Norwegian Church and Kingdom. Their older, more independent emigrant identity slowly gave way to something more fully integrated into the medieval order. The old Western Sea world survived for centuries in one place or another, but piece by piece it began to break apart. The Scandinavian foothold in England weakened and disappeared. In Ireland, the Hiberno-Norse political order was finally overwhelmed in the late 12th century as Anglo-Norman and Gaelic forces reshaped the island again. In mainland Scotland and the Western Isles, Scandinavian political dominance also faded. The Northern Isles remained under Scandinavian rule far longer, and even there the old language survived in some places until surprisingly late. But the wider Western Scandinavian world as a distinct political and cultural sphere slowly dissolved. And yet its legacy endured. In Ireland, and especially in Scotland, it survives most clearly in place names. In the North Atlantic islands, it survived even more deeply because those places had not had older, settled populations to absorb the newcomers in the same way. There, Scandinavian identity remained stronger and lasted longer. But even in Ireland, where the Norse were eventually absorbed, the old Hiberno-Scandinavian world left a lasting imprint. It reshaped urban life, trade, maritime culture, craft production, and the flow of goods and ideas between the Irish Sea and the North Atlantic. That is why the relationship between Ireland and the North Atlantic colonies matters so much. The Scandinavian world of the West was not held together only by memory of Norway. It was also held together by Dublin, by the Irish ports, by hybrid crafts, by borrowed technologies, by ringed pins, arm rings, maritime terms, and the quiet spread of shared habits. In the countryside, settlers kept the longhouse and the old rhythms of Scandinavian farming. In the towns of Ireland, they found markets, workshops, and cultural forms shaped by constant contact with the Irish. Out of those two poles, rural continuity and urban hybridization, a new Western identity was born. When Scandinavian settlers first spread across Ireland and the North Atlantic, they did not carry only weapons, ships, and ambition. They also carried habits of speech, ways of building, tools of daily life, and a clear sense of what a proper home and a proper community should look like. Yet, as these settlers moved farther west, especially into Ireland and then beyond into the Scottish Isles, the Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland, their world began to change. The result was not simply a copy of Scandinavia overseas. It became something broader and more complex, a Western sea world shaped by both Scandinavian and Celtic influence. One small but revealing clue lies in names. Even in late medieval Dublin, old Scandinavian personal names still survived, though they were no longer common. Some of them were familiar names from the Old Norse world, especially compounds built around Thor. Their survival shows continuity, but their rarity shows change. The Norse-speaking community had not vanished, yet it was no longer as culturally dominant or as separate as it had once been. By that stage, Scandinavian identity in Ireland had already been mixed, worn down, adapted, and folded into a wider urban society. Language tells the same story even more clearly. The number of Norse loanwords in Irish is not large, but the kind of words borrowed matters enormously. Some belong to farming life and suggest close contact in the countryside, around Viking strongholds. Others belong to clothing and everyday domestic life. Still others come from trade, law, and administration. These are the words of people who dealt with one another often enough to exchange not just goods, but habits and practices. But the most important group of all belongs to the sea. Some of the key maritime terms in Irish came from Norse. Words for rudder, sheet, thwart, anchor, rope, steersman, and warship entered the language through contact with the Vikings. Even names of deep-sea fish came with them. That is not a minor detail. It means the Vikings helped reshape how the Irish thought and spoke about seafaring. In a very real sense, they widened Ireland's practical relationship with the sea. And yet, the Norse linguistic mark on Ireland remained surprisingly light when compared with England. That tells us something important. The Scandinavian presence in Ireland, though powerful, did not spread as deeply and broadly through the rural landscape as it did in parts of the Danelaw. The Vikings in Ireland remained above all a coastal, urban, and maritime force. Their towns mattered enormously, their fleets mattered enormously, but the Irish language and the Irish countryside remained strong enough to absorb them without being transformed on the English model. To understand what made Viking Ireland so important, we need to place it inside a much larger story. From the late 8th century onward, Scandinavian expansion stretched westward on a remarkable scale. It reached Ireland, England, Scotland, the Hebrides, Orkney, Shetland, the Faroes, Iceland, Greenland, and even the edge of North America. Over time, this created a broad Scandinavian world of the western seas. It was not an empire in the neat, later medieval sense, but it was a connected sphere of movement, trade, settlement, and cultural exchange. The sea that separated these communities also tied them together. It became less a barrier than a highway. Within that Western world, Ireland played a special role. The Scandinavian settlements farther north, especially in the islands and the North Atlantic, were overwhelmingly rural. They were built around farmsteads, grazing systems, local assemblies, and scattered communities. They had legal structures, regional identities, and strong traditions. But they generally lacked true towns. Ireland was different. There, the Scandinavians founded and rebuilt urban centres such as Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick. These towns became commercial and political hubs. That made Ireland the urban heart of the Western Scandinavian world. The settlers, who spread into the North Atlantic, did not abandon their Scandinavian habits. Across widely separated lands, from Scotland to Greenland, we can recognise the same broad building tradition. The longhouse remained central. Even where timber was scarce and landscapes were almost treeless, settlers clung to the familiar shape of the Scandinavian house, adapting it with stone walls and local materials. That choice was not simply practical. In fact, in some places it was highly impractical, because wood was so limited. The longhouse endured because it meant something. It was part of how these people defined home, authority, safety, and social life. It was a cultural marker, a familiar structure that allowed emigrants to feel they still belonged to the same world, even when they had crossed vast stretches of ocean. The same continuity appears in other parts of material culture. Certain tools, raw materials, and household objects travelled with Scandinavian settlers from the homelands into the Western colonies. Soapstone vessels, whetstones, and other everyday items reveal strong continuity of habit and taste, but conditions differed sharply from place to place. In Shetland, good stone resources made it easier to maintain parts of the old toolkit. In the Faroes, where such materials were lacking, finished objects or raw materials had to be imported. This meant the Western Scandinavian communities could never be fully self-contained. Even if they were farming societies on remote islands, they depended on wider networks of exchange. That is where Ireland's towns became vital. Once the Scandinavian urban centres in Ireland had become firmly established in the early 10th century, they offered the rural communities of the North Atlantic something they themselves did not possess: access to markets, workshops, imported goods, bullion, skilled craftspeople, and long-distance trade. Dublin in particular became more than a local town. It became one of the great supply and exchange centres of the Western Viking world. Through it, and through other Irish ports, the northern colonies could obtain both practical necessities and prestige goods. And this urban role shaped culture as well as economy. Some forms of personal equipment that spread widely through the North Atlantic seem to have moved outward from the Scandinavian settlements in Ireland. This may have been a matter of ideas, fashion, and imitation, but it may also reflect the movement of people themselves. The Western Sea world was full of travellers, craftsmen, merchants, warriors, fostered children, wives, slaves, and migrants of mixed background. Cultural transfer was not abstract. It happened through human movement. One of the clearest examples is the ringed pin. This object was not originally Scandinavian. Its roots were Irish and Celtic. Yet Scandinavian settlers in Ireland adopted it quickly, reshaped it in their own way, and turned it into one of the most characteristic items of dress across the Western Viking world. By the 10th century, ringed pins of Hiberno-Norse style were appearing from Ireland to Iceland and even farther west. Their distribution shows that they belonged above all to the emigrant world of the Atlantic colonies. They were not simply Irish objects anymore, and they were not purely Scandinavian either. They had become Western Norse objects, products of a hybrid identity that first took shape in the Irish Sea Zone. Arm rings made from jet or lignite tell a similar story. Evidence from Dublin shows that these objects were being worked there, and they also appear across the settlements of Scotland, the Northern Isles, the Faroes, and Iceland. Again, this was not a pattern centred on Norway itself. These ornaments belong to a Western sphere, one in which Irish and Scandinavian influences had already fused. Such objects were not just decorative. They helped express who people were. They told the wearer, and everyone who saw the wearer, that this was someone formed in the Western Viking world, not simply in the old Scandinavian homeland. Technology may tell a similar story. For a long time, horizontal mills in the islands of the West were often treated as if they were purely Norse imports. But the details of the millstones complicate that view. Certain structural features found on querns and millstones in the Western colonies seem not to have come from Scandinavia at all. Instead, they have closer links with technology already known in the British Isles and Ireland before the Viking Age, perhaps ultimately inherited through Roman influence. If that is correct, then the horizontal mill in the West may not have been something Scandinavians simply brought with them unchanged. It may have been something they adopted, adapted, and then carried onward through their own settlement world. In other words, just like the ringed pin, it may have become part of Scandinavian life only after close contact with Celtic and British societies. The same may be true of the shieling system in some North Atlantic regions. In places such as the Faroes, seasonal upland farming sites appear linked to place names that contain a Gaelic-derived term for shieling. This is a powerful clue. It suggests that some aspects of pastoral organisation in the North Atlantic were influenced not directly from Norway, but from the Hiberno-Scandinavian and Irish Sea world. Such a feature would make perfect sense in a mixed cultural zone where Scandinavian settlers were learning from neighbouring Celtic-speaking communities, and then carrying adapted practices into new settlements farther north and west. There may even be similar questions to ask about baking stones. These have often been regarded as an original Norwegian development, but finds in Shetland suggest a more complicated picture. It is possible that these two belong to a pattern of exchange in which settlers in the Western colonies encountered local practices, adapted them, and later transmitted them back eastward. If so, then influence did not run in one direction only. The Western colonies were not passive recipients of Scandinavian culture. They became active zones of innovation and transformation in their own right. This possibility becomes even more intriguing when we think about population movement in the late 9th century. At the same time that political consolidation was reshaping Norway, there was also instability in the Hiberno-Scandinavian world of the Western Isles. Groups of mixed Scandinavian and Gaelic character, often associated with the Irish Sea region, seem to have been on the move. If emigrants from Norway merged with Hiberno-Scandinavian groups already drifting north and west, then the resulting communities in places like the Faroes and Iceland would have inherited a blended identity from the very start. That would help explain why the earliest settlers in those regions are sometimes associated in tradition with Christian or Celtic names, and why material culture in the Atlantic colonies so often combines Scandinavian structures with Western, especially Irish Sea, influences. For a time, this Western Scandinavian world flourished. It stretched from the old homelands to the urban ports of Ireland and on into the island colonies of the North Atlantic. But it did not last forever. After around 1100, a new phase began. Christian institutions grew stronger. The Western colonies were drawn more tightly into the orbit of the Norwegian Church and Kingdom. Their older, more independent emigrant identity slowly gave way to something more fully integrated into the medieval order. The old Western Sea world survived for centuries in one place or another, but piece by piece it began to break apart. The Scandinavian foothold in England weakened and disappeared. In Ireland, the Hiberno-Norse political order was finally overwhelmed in the late 12th century, as Anglo-Norman and Gaelic forces reshaped the island again. In mainland Scotland and the Western Isles, Scandinavian political dominance also faded. The Northern Isles remained under Scandinavian rule far longer, and even there the old language survived in some places until surprisingly late. But the wider Western Scandinavian world as a distinct political and cultural sphere slowly dissolved. And yet its legacy endured. In Ireland, and especially in Scotland, it survives most clearly in place names. In the North Atlantic islands, it survived even more deeply because those places had not had older, settled populations to absorb the newcomers in the same way. There, Scandinavian identity remained stronger and lasted longer. But even in Ireland, where the Norse were eventually absorbed, the old Hiberno-Scandinavian world left a lasting imprint. It reshaped urban life, trade, maritime culture, craft production, and the flow of goods and ideas between the Irish Sea and the North Atlantic. That is why the relationship between Ireland and the North Atlantic colonies matters so much. The Scandinavian world of the West was not held together only by memory of Norway. It was also held together by Dublin, by the Irish ports, by hybrid crafts, by borrowed technologies, by ringed pins, arm rings, maritime terms, and the quiet spread of shared habits. In the countryside, settlers kept the longhouse and the old rhythms of Scandinavian farming. In the towns of Ireland, they found markets, workshops, and cultural forms shaped by constant contact with the Irish. Out of those two poles, rural continuity and urban hybridization, a new Western identity was born.